The 56th plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order. The General Assembly will begin its consideration of Agenda Item 62, entitled The Situation in the Temporarily Occupied Territories of Ukraine. Excellencies, honorable ministers, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Tomorrow, the 24th of February, marks the second solemn anniversary of the launch by the Russian Federation's full-scale aggression against Ukraine, plunging its sovereign neighbor and innocent civilians into terror and suffering. The world bore witness as that fateful day marked the onset of a series of protracted, illegal, and flagrant violations of the UN Charter and of international law. As you, the representatives of UN member states, gather here today, you can neither be blind to the ongoing destruction and devastation or ignore the plight of the people of Ukraine. This is especially so because this year also coincides with the 10th anniversary of the 2014 attempted illegal annexation of Crimea and other Ukrainian territories by the Russian Federation. Excellencies, over the past 2 years, millions of innocent civilians have been uprooted from their homes and forced to flee in search of safety and shelter. Schools and hospitals, constituting key elements of civilian infrastructure protected from attack under international law, as symbols of hope and healing, today lie in utter and calculated ruin. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has verified disturbing increases in non-combatant casualties, with the number of civilian deaths and injuries in January of this year hiking 37% higher than in November of 2023. And in the midst of all of this, we must not overlook the peculiar situation of Ukrainian children, thousands of whom were torn from their families and forcibly deported to Russia, thus stripped of the warmth and safety of their homes and loved ones. These innocent children, unlawfully abducted, must be repatriated to Ukraine and reunited with their families at once. But we must also be mindful that the impact of this war extends far beyond the borders of Ukraine. The environment, the silent victim of conflict, is threatened by the chemical effluent released from damaged facilities and from the increased pollution and greenhouse gas emissions associated with the ongoing fighting. Further, the militarization of the nuclear sites runs the real risk of a nuclear accident, an outcome that would undoubtedly spell a disaster of epic proportions. And ultimately, the war has affected every member state gathered in this hall, whether in the form of soaring food prices or in the context of energy insecurity. Without doubt, this needless war has been a significant catalyst in reshaping world geopolitics and geoeconomics, not only inflicting direct harm on the countries involved, but also impeding the developmental progress of numerous others, especially developing countries. It is actively undermining the very foundations of our UN Charter, threatening the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity we all committed to hold dear and to defend. It has bred and accentuated distrust, instability, and unpredictability on a global scale. It has disrupted the delicate balance of international relations at a time when unity, solidarity, and cooperation are absolutely crucial to multilateral problem solving. Excellencies, we are simultaneously grappling with the existential threat of climate change and strive to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We cannot afford to let aggression and conflict derail our progress. We must never forget, war stands in direct opposition to the goals we have committed to pursue. Consequently, the responsibility falls upon each and every one of us to uphold and to defend the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, our Charter, and in doing so, to ensure the primacy of and respect for the rule of law. That includes heeding the orders of international courts, particularly those rendered by the International Court of Justice in March of last year, calling for the Russian Federation to immediately suspend its military operations in Ukraine. While the Security Council may be paralyzed by division, let us draw strength from the collective voice of the General Assembly, which has pronounced itself condemning the aggression and demanding the immediate, complete, and unconditional withdrawal of Russian military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Beyond condemnations, we, the United Nations, must actively work towards a comprehensive, just, and sustainable peace in line with the charter of this organization. The resolution adopted by the General Assembly a year ago provides a roadmap to achieve this goal. I note with appreciation the international consultations that have occurred in Denmark, Saudi Arabia, Malta, and most recently in Davos, Switzerland. These consultations build on the General Assembly's resolutions and represent crucial steps towards finding a permanent solution to this crisis. We must support all efforts that could open the possibility of a process aimed at resolving this conflict through diplomacy and dialogue, always ensuring that such processes align with the foundational principles of the Charter, international law, and General Assembly resolutions. Excellencies, honorable ministers, as we reflect on the 2 years of anguish and hardship, let us emerge from this place with a resounding message of solidarity and unwavering support to the resilient people of Ukraine. They have endured unimaginable suffering with dignity, courage, and resilience, and continue to marshal the strong determination to defend their homeland. As the United Nations and this General Assembly, we must stand with them in their quest for justice and peace. And as your President, I join you in this clarion call. Let us redouble our efforts to end wars and usher in a future of hope, promise, and prosperity for the people of Ukraine and Russia alike, and indeed elsewhere without exception. Let us use this meeting to reaffirm our commitment to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and to the rule of law. Together we can build a world where not only does peace prevail, but moreover, justice reigns supreme. I thank you. As announced yesterday via the e-delegate portal, I would like to remind members that they are encouraged to limit their statements to no more than 5 minutes in order to allow as many delegations as possible to deliver statements at the meeting this morning before continuing on Monday, the 26th of February. It is my pleasure now to invite His Excellency Dmytro Kuleba, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, to take the floor. Excellency, the floor is yours.
I am grateful to all UN member states who have consistently supported important General Assembly calls condemning Russian aggression against Ukraine and urging Moscow to cease hostilities. This Assembly has demonstrated on numerous occasions that the global majority stands on the side of Ukraine, which is effectively the side of the UN Charter, international law, and peace. Over 140 member states have chosen exactly such a fair stance. This represents roughly 3/4 of the United Nations. If this Assembly could end the war and restore Ukraine's territorial integrity through passing a bill, Ukraine would already be at peace. If Russia had implemented the order of the International Court of Justice of March 16, 2022, we would also already be living in peace. Let me remind you that the court indicated among its provisional measures that the Russian Federation shall immediately suspend the military operations it began on February 24, 2022 in the territory of Ukraine. End of quote. This legally binding decision remains in force today. We can also see that in these 2 years, global security has only deteriorated. More and more wars and conflicts are flaring up across the globe. One of the reasons for this is the bleeding wound in the heart of Europe. Unfortunately, Russia ignores the will of the global majority. It continues its aggression and throws more and more men into the flames of war. It persists in killing and maiming Ukrainian soldiers and civilians, as well as brutally violating basic human rights in the occupied territories. Distinguished delegates, Russia cannot ignore the voice of the world majority if we all take a principled stance and act together. The peace formula proposed by President Zelensky represents exactly such an opportunity. You are all aware of the formula's 10 points. They envisage not only the end of hostilities, but also proposals to strengthen food security, nuclear safety, environmental protection, energy security, international justice, human rights, and respect for the UN Charter. Ukraine has been working tirelessly to mobilize international support for our peace plan. In less than a year, the number of countries and international organizations taking part in peace formula meetings went up from 15 to 82. And I thank every nation and every institution, including the United Nations, for joining. This demonstrates a growing global understanding that the peace formula is the only way forward to a just and lasting peace. Most importantly, countries involved in this process represent all continents and regions of the world. This is not a Western undertaking. This is a truly global initiative based on the UN Charter and relevant General Assembly resolutions. Ukraine is now actively working with partners to prepare the first Global Peace Summit that is set to take place in Switzerland. I strongly encourage every UN member state present in this assembly to take active part in the process and attend the future Global Peace Summit. This will be a real opportunity to agree on a fair and comprehensive vision of peace. Once we have this global and common position, Russia will have no other choice than to engage in this process in good faith. Mr. President, dear member states, the scale of this war and its global implications are enormous, as well as the suffering of Ukrainians. I particularly drive your attention to the fate of thousands of prisoners of war who are still in Russian captivity. They are often mistreated, and Russia obstructs access of international monitors to them. They must be released and exchanged. Human rights violations in the occupied territories include political persecution, arbitrary detentions, torture, and sexual abuse, as well as forced conscription and intentional altering of demographics. Stealing Ukrainian children and taking civilian hostages are some of the most horrible Russian crimes. In our view, UN can and should be more active and swift in deploying existing instruments and developing the new ones when necessary to help bring back Ukrainian children deported to Russia, return civilian captives, the most internationally overlooked vulnerable group, prosecute systemic cases of sexual violence committed by Russian soldiers against Ukrainian civilians and servicemen, and crimes against environment. There is literally not a single atrocity listed in the Rome Statute that Russia has not committed in the course of this war. And it is not surprising that the Russian president himself is on the ICC wanted list for stealing Ukrainian kids. And with all of this in the background, Russia has enough insolence to try to shift the blame and evade responsibility. It spread numerous lies in order to manipulate public opinion abroad and blame others for the war that Moscow says started and refuses to end. I therefore call on everyone present in this assembly and outside of it to dismiss Russian lies. They are nothing more than attempts to shift the blame and avoid responsibility. The only reason for this war has been and remains Russia's denial of Ukraine's right to exist and its continued colonial conquest. Moscow's aim is to destroy Ukraine, and they're quite outspoken about it. Dear colleagues, fellow diplomats, no nation in the world wants peace more than Ukraine. Our country suffers the most, but we also know that peace must be just and durable. Simply putting the war on hold and hoping that the aggressor will be merciful enough to eventually choose peace is not a realistic plan. Those who say that Ukraine just needs to negotiate with Russia and end the war are either ill-informed or never followed what happened between 2014 and 2022. During that 8 years, Ukraine and Russia held approximately 200 rounds of peace negotiations in various formats and made 20 ceasefire agreements. All of these peace efforts ended 2 years ago, when Russia tore apart the Minsk process and launched its full-scale invasion of my country. Why would anyone suggest today that following the same logic will bring us to a different result? Ukraine's peace formula remains the only serious peace proposal on the table. and every peace-loving nation in this assembly, and I'm certain that the absolute majority of you represent peace-loving nations, can add its diplomatic weight to putting the peace formula in action. If we are serious about restoring peace not only in Ukraine but also globally, it is time to abandon wishful thinking and engage in realistic and hard work. The Global Peace Summit offers exactly such a concrete and realistic path to peace. I urge all of you to assist us in the undertaking. And I would also like to conclude by saying thank you to every nation that has stood by the people of Ukraine throughout these terrible years. We shall jointly prevail. Thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine, and I now invite the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation to take the floor.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President,
думаю, что для каждого, кто
I
способен на самостоятельный,
that
незашоренный
for
анализ
anyone who is
ситуации,
capable of an
очевидно, что
independent,
вынесенная
unbiased analysis of the
сегодня на
situation,
обсуждение
it is
Генеральной
obvious that the
Ассамблеи
topic
ООН
under
тема
discussion today at the
не
United
имеет
Nations
ничего
General
общего с
Assembly has
действительностью,
nothing
носит
to do with
исключительно
reality
заказной политический
and
характер.
serves solely to
Реальность
promote
же
a
такова,
political
что временно
agenda. The
оккупированной
reality
территории Украины
is
не
that there
существует.
are no
Есть
temporarily
российские
occupied
регионы, Крым,
territories of Ukraine,
10-ю годовщину
but there are
воссоединения,
Russian
которую мы будем
regions such as
отмечать уже в
Crimea, the
марте.
10th anniversary
И
of the reunification with which we will
присоединившиеся по
celebrate in
итогам
March,
законного
and
волеизъявления
the
народа
regions which
Донецкой и
exceeded
Луганской
as a result
республики,
of
а
the
также
legitimate
Херсонской и
expression of the
Запорожской области.
people's will, the Donetsk and
Сегодня мы
Luhansk
услышали
republics,
и
as
еще
well as the
услышим
Kherson and
много вранья на
Zaporizhia
эту тему от
regions.
представителей
We
Киева и
have
его
heard and will
западных
continue to
спонсоров.
hear many lies on the
За
subject
этим
today from the
прослеживается
representatives of
стремление не
Kiev and
просто
its
исказить
Western
факты,
sponsors.
но и вообще
Behind this is a
переписать
desire
историю.
not just to
Дело в
distort the
том, что
facts,
ее
but to
правдивая,
rewrite history
искаженная
in general.
версия для
The fact
наших
is that the
западных коллег
truthful,
крайне
undistorted
неудобна.
version of history is
И тогда
extremely
им придется
inconvenient
признать свою
for our Western
ответственность за провоцирование
colleagues,
и
because then
развязывание
they would have to
украинского
admit their
кризиса, за
responsibility
многолетнюю
for provoking and
подготовку
unleashing the
Украины к войне
Ukrainian
с
crisis for
Россией под
years
ширмой Минских
of preparing
договоренностей,
Ukraine for war with Russia
за
under the
взращивание на
pretext of the
Украине
Minsk agreements,
ростков
for
национализма и
nurturing the
неонацизма,
sprouts of
которые после
nationalism and
2013
neo-Nazism
года
in
расцвели
Ukraine,
там
which have come into
буйным
full
цветом.
bloom there since
Ничего
2013.
этого наши западные коллеги
Of
делать,
course,
разумеется, не хотят. Их
our
интересам
Western
отвечает
neighbors,
насаждение
our Western
черно-белого
colleagues do not want to
нарратива,
do any of
где Россия
this. Their
где
interests are
Россия
served
агрессор,
by
а
propagating a black
Украина
and white
невинная жертва.
narrative where Russia is the aggressor
Однако
and Ukraine
отвечать за
is the
сделанное
innocent
с
victim.
Украиной коллективному Западу
However, the
все-таки
collective
придется.
West will
Как
still
и
have
за
to answer for
избирательную
what has been
слепоту и
done to
глухоту,
Kiev, as well as for the selective
проявлявшуюся им
blindness
все
and
последние
deafness
годы.
that it has shown throughout
Как могут
all
страны,
these
претендующие на
years.
то, чтобы называться
How can countries
цивилизованными
that
и
claim to be
демократическими,
civilized and
не услышать,
democratic
например,
not
сделанную в
hear, for
2015 году
example, the
заявлений
statements made in
премьер-министра
2015 by
Яценюка о
Prime
том, что
Minister
на Донбассе
Yatsenyuk that
проживают
those who
невинные,
live in Donbass
или
are
произнесенных в
subhuman,
2021
or
году
the
слов
words
действующего
of
президента
incumbent
Зеленского,
President
который
Zelensky in
назвал их существами
2021,
и
who
усами.
called them creatures and
У тех, кто
specimens.
владеет фактами о действиях
Those who are in
киевского
possession
режима
of the facts
и не
regarding
пытаются подменить
Kiev's
действительность
actions and
пропагандистскими
are not trying
речевками,
to replace
не
reality with
возникает вопросов
propaganda,
о причине
do not have any
вхождения
questions regarding
в
the
состав
reasons
Российской
behind the
Федерации нового
incorporation of
субъекта.
new subjects into the
Оно
Russian
стало
Federation.
закономерным следствием
It was a natural
политики истребления
consequences
собственного
of the
населения
policy
неонацистским
of
режимом,
exterminating its own
пришедшим к власти
population
в
that was carried out
2014
by the
году в
neo-Nazi
результате
regime, which came
кровавого
to power in
переворота,
2014 as a
организованного,
result of the
спонсированного
bloody
и
coup
открыто
organized,
поддержанного
sponsored,
Западом.
and openly supported by
Всегда
the West.
чувствовавшие свою
Having
неразрывную
always
историческую и
felt
культурную
an
связь с
unbreakable
Россией,
historical and
проживающие на
cultural bond to
юго-востоке граждане
Russia,
Украины
the
не захотели
citizens living in
подчиниться
the
новой
southeast of Ukraine
нелегитимной власти,
did not want to
требовавшей от них
submit to these
отказаться
new
от собственной
illegitimate
культурной
authorities, which
и
demanded that
исторической
they renounce
идентичности
their
и
own
прославлять
cultural and
пособников
historical
Гитлера,
identity
ответственных
and
за массовые
glorify
убийства
Hitler's
евреев,
accomplices,
поляков,
which were
русских,
responsible for the mass
украинцев в
murder of
годы Второй
Jews,
мировой
Russians,
войны.
Poles, and Ukrainians
Тогда
during the Second World
постмайданные
War.
радикалы-националисты встали на
Then
путь
the
игнорирования
post-Maidan radical
основополагающих прав
nationalists
и
began
свобод
to
своих
ignore
же
the fundamental
соотечественников,
rights and freedoms of
устроив
their own
гонения на
fellow
неугодное
citizens and
население
began
по
persecuting
национальному,
undesirable
языковому и
populations
религиозному
on
признаку.
ethnic, linguistic, and
Ввели
religious
финансовую и
grounds.
социальную блокаду
They
жителям
imposed a
Донбасса.
financial and social
Прекратили
blockade
выплачивать
on the
социальные пособия
inhabitants
и
of
пенсии,
Donbass, stopped
лишали
paying social
услуг
benefits and patients,
здравоохранения.
and deprived them of
Чуть ли не
healthcare
каждый год
services.
принимали законы, все
Almost
более
every year, new
усугубляющие
laws were
положение
adopted that
населения
made the
Донбасса.
situation
На
of
протяжении
Donbass's
8 лет
population worse and
их
worse.
методично и безнаказанно
Throughout 8 years,
обстреливали,
they were
калечили
methodically
и убивали.
shelled, maimed, and
Можно
killed with
долго перечислять
impunity.
бесчеловечные
It would take a
преступления
long
украинских
time to
карательных
list all the
батальонов в
inhuman
отношении ни в
crimes
чем
of
не повинных
Ukrainian
людей.
punitive battalions against
Напомню лишь
innocent
про трагедию в
people.
Одесском доме
I will only
профсоюза,
recall the
где когда
tragedy
погибло
in the Odessa
48
Trade
человек,
Union House when
42 были
48
заживо
people
сожжены,
died,
а
were
тех, кому
killed rather,
удалось
42 were
выпрыгнуть
burned
из окон
alive, and those who
полыхающего
managed to jump
здания,
out the windows of the
добивали
burning
и
building
расстреливали.
were
Или
shot to
про смерть
death.
Горловской Мадонны при
I will also
артобстреле в
recall the death
2014
of the
году.
Gorlovka
Кадры
Madonna
искалеченного
during
тела
shelling
молодой
in
женщины,
2014.
прижимающей к груди 10-месячную
Images of a
дочь,
mutilated body of a
облетели весь
young
мир и
woman
стали
clutching her
символом
10-month-old
бесчеловечной
daughter
политики
to her
новых
chest
властей
flew around the
Киева,
world
но
and
остались
became a symbol
незамеченными
of
западными
Kiev's inhuman
покровителями
policies.
бандеровских неонацистов.
However, they went
И таких
unnoticed by
примеров
Western
можно привести
patrons
сотни.
of the Banderite neo-Nazis,
Крыму
and there are
повезло
hundreds
больше.
of such
Почти сразу после
examples.
госпереворота, верно
Crimea was
оценив истинное
luckier.
лицо
Almost
новой
immediately
власти,
after the
крымчане
coup,
сделали выбор
having
в пользу
rightly assessed
возвращения
the
на свою
true
историческую
nature, the
родину
true face of the
и
new
в
authorities,
соответствии с
Crimeans
правом
made a
на
choice in favor of
самоопределение,
returning to their
зафиксированным
historical
в Уставе
homelands
ООН.
in accordance with the
Дальнейшие
right to
события подтвердили
self-determination as
правильность такого
enshrined
шага.
enshrined
Уже
in the
после
UN
начала
Charter.
специальной военной
Further events
операции,
confirmed that this was the right
призванной
choice.
остановить
After
восьмилетнюю
the
войну
special
киевского
military
режима против
operation
мирного
began
населения
in order to
Донбасса,
stop the 8-year
путь
war of
крымчан
the Kiev regime
повторили еще
against the
4
civilians of
бывших
Donbass,
украинских региона.
4 other former Ukrainian
Подобный поворот
regions
событий
made the
крайне
same
неудобен для
decision
Украины,
as
ведь рассказы
Crimea.
про то,
This
что
turn of
жители Украины
events is
боятся
extremely
российских вооруженных
inconvenient
сил,
for Ukraine.
что они столкнутся с настоящей партизанской
After all,
войной,
the stories about
вдребезги
Ukrainian
разбиваются
citizens
о
being afraid of
неопровержимые
Russian armed
факты, свидетельствующие
forces,
об обратном.
stories that they
Население
will face a true
освобожденных
guerrilla
городов
war
встречает
are completely
бойцов как
destroyed by
освободителей,
irrefutable facts
благодарит за то,
testifying
что
to the
Россия их не
contrary.
бросила.
The people of the liberated
Только что
towns
мы
are
наблюдали,
greeting
как радуются нашим солдатам мирные
Russian
жители
soldiers as
освобожденной
liberators. They were
Авдеевки, где
thankful that Russia has
укронацисты
not
за 9
abandoned
лет
them. We have just seen
создали
this in
сверхукрепленный
Kiev, where
рубеж, с
civilians
которого методично
rejoiced at the
обстреливали
arrival of our
расположенные в
soldiers
нескольких
because in
километрах Донецк.
Avdiivka over
А
9
раньше,
years,
до
Ukrainian
начала
Nazis
специальной
created a
военной
super
операции,
fortified frontier
настоящим
from which
бельмом
they
на глазу для
methodically shelled
киевского
Donetsk a few
режима были
kilometers away.
публикации своих
And before
сограждан,
the start of the
миллион которых
military
ежегодно
operation, the
отдыхал
real
в
thorn in
российском
the side of the
Крыму
Kiev
и
regime
публиковал восторженные
was the
отклики в
publications of
соцсетях.
its own citizens, a million of whom
Представитель Киева в
annually
своем выступлении,
vacationed in the
разумеется,
Russian
не сказал,
Crimea and
что
published
Крымский
glowing
полуостров в
reviews
составе
online.
Украины был
The
абсолютно
representative of
заброшенным
Kiev
регионом.
naturally failed to say
Его
in a statement
инфраструктурой не
that
занимались.
the
Социально-экономические
Crimean
проблемы
Peninsula was a
решались
completely
по
abandoned region
остаточному
when it was
принципу
part of
и не носили
Ukraine. Its
общесистемного
infrastructure was
характера.
neglected, its
За последние же
socioeconomic
10 лет
problems
Крым
were addressed
преобразился.
as an afterthought
Реализуются
and in a piecemeal
социально-экономические
fashion.
проекты в сферах
Over the
здравоохранения,
past 10
культуры и
years, however,
образования.
Crimea has been
Реальные
transformed.
зарплаты в бюджетном
Socioeconomic
секторе, а
projects are
также
being
пенсии и
implemented
пособия
in the
растут.
areas of healthcare, culture,
Введены
and
стройки тепловые
education.
электростанции. Активно
Real
продвигается
salaries in the
строительство
public sector are
газовых
growing,
магистралей и
along with
транспортной
pensions and
инфраструктуры.
benefits. Thermal power plants have been put into
Стоящий
operation. Gas
достаточно
pipelines,
остро вопрос
transportation
безопасности
infrastructure is
водоснабжения
being
из-за действий
constructed.
неонацистов, устроивших Крыму водную
The
блокаду,
acute
тоже
issue of
решен.
water
2
supply,
года назад была, наконец,
which was
ликвидирована
created
дамба,
by the
возведенная
neo-Nazis who
Украиной
organized
для
the
перекрытия
water
водотока.
blockade of Ukraine, has also
Проделана
been
гигантская
resolved.
работа
2
по
years ago, the
повышению
dam put up by
инвестиционной и
Ukraine to
туристической
block the water was
привлекательности
finally
региона.
removed.
Отдельно хочу
Vast amounts of work
остановиться
have
на
been done to
соблюдении прав и
increase the
свобод всех
investment and tourism
нацменьшинств,
attractiveness of the
проживающих на
region.
территории Крыма.
I would like to particularly
На
address the
протяжении
issue of
последних
the rights and
лет
freedoms of national
Киев
minorities
стращал всех
living in
якобы
Crimea.
ущемлением
In
России
recent
прав
years, Kiev
крымских
has been
татар
telling
с
horror
стиранием
stories
их
about Russia's alleged
идентичности. Однако
infringement on the
недавнее
rights of
решение
Crimean
Международного суда
Tatars and the
ООН
erasure
по
of their identity.
соответствующему иску Украины по
However,
Международной
the
конвенции
recent decision
о
of the
ликвидации
International Court
всех
of
форм
Justice on
расовой
Ukraine's
дискриминации
claim under the
полностью
International Convention
показал
on the Elimination of all
несостоятельность этих
forms of racial
претензий.
discrimination
Более того,
has
суд не
fully
нашел
demonstrated the
признаков расовой
invalidity of these
дискриминации в
claims.
российском
What's
законодательстве
more,
и
the court
практике его
found no
применения.
signs of racial discrimination in
Отвергнуты
Russian
ложные
legislation
обвинения
and
в
its application
дискриминации
in
крымских
practice.
татар и украинцев
It also
в
rejected the false
отношении доступа
accusations of
к СМИ,
discrimination
образованию и
against
возможности
Crimean
реализации
Tatars and
своих
Ukrainians
культурных
with regard to their
потребностей на
access to
крымско-татарском и
media,
украинском языках.
education, and
Крайне
cultural
показательный следующий
opportunities in their own
факт, скрывшийся в
languages.
ходе судебного
The
разбирательства.
following fact,
Киев
which came to
пытался
light
обвинить Россию
during the
в
trial, is very
уничтожении
telling. Kiev
культурного
tried to
наследия
accuse
Крыма.
Russia of destroying
По
Crimea's
факту же было
cultural
установлено,
heritage.
что наше
However,
государство занималось
it was
масштабной
established
и
that our state was
дорогостоящей
actually
реставрацией
engaged in a
исторических
large-scale and
памятников,
expensive
которые пришли в
restoration
запустение
project
и начали разрушаться в
meant
период
to
нахождения
rebuild historical monuments that had fallen into
В
disrepair
Новороссии
and
на
begun
Донбассе
to
также
deteriorate while
осуществляются
Crimea was
проекты по
part of
возрождению этих
Ukraine.
регионов,
Projects are
продвигается их
also being
интеграция в
implemented
единое
in Novorossiya
правовое
and
и
Donbass to
социально-экономическое
revitalize those
пространство
regions
страны.
and
Восстанавливается
incorporate
промышленность,
them into
сельское
the
хозяйство и
unified legal
инфраструктура.
and
Поставлена
socioeconomic
цель к
framework of the
2030
country.
году вывести
Industry,
регионы на
agriculture,
общероссийский уровень
infrastructure
по
are being
ключевым
restored.
направлениям,
The goal is to
определяющим
make sure
качество
these
жизни
regions
человека.
catch up to the
Самое же
national
главное, во
average
всех этих
in
процессах с
key areas
энтузиазмом
that determine the
участвуют
quality of life
сами
by
наши новые
2030.
граждане,
Most
которые именно
importantly,
с Россией
our new
связывают свое
citizens
будущее.
are themselves
Господин
enthusiastically
председатель, если в
participating in
ретроспективе
these
посмотреть на все
processes, and they
случившееся за
see
последние
their
10 лет,
future as
то
part
сам
of
собой
Russia.
возникает вопрос,
Mr. President,
можно
if
ли
we
было
look
всего
at
этого
everything that took
избежать?
place over the past
Не
10
Россия
years,
начала эту
the
войну,
question
Россия
that arises
пришла,
is,
чтобы
could
наконец
this have
ее
all been
остановить.
avoided? Russia did not
Киевской
start
власти
this war,
всего-то
it
нужно
came to
было
put an
уважать права
end to
людей,
it. All
дать им
the Kiev
возможность
authorities
спокойно
had to do
существовать
was
на своей
respect people's
территории,
rights,
обучаться на
let
родном
them live in
языке,
peace on their own
иметь свободу
territory, study in
вероисповедания
their own
и отличную
language,
от насаждаемой
enjoy
точки
freedom of
зрения.
religion and
Не
freedom of
уклоняться от
thought,
прямого диалога с
to not shy
несогласными,
away
а
from
приложить
direct dialogue
необходимые
with
усилия для
dissenters, but
обеспечения
rather to
достойного
make the
будущего в
necessary
составе
efforts to
Украины.
ensure a decent
Кстати
future for them
сказать,
as
это
part of
ровно то, что
Ukraine.
обещал
And by the
перед
way, this
президентскими
is
выборами в
exactly
2019 году
what was
кандидат
promised
Зеленский, за
before the
которого в итоге
presidential elections
проголосовало
in
2/3
2019 by
избирателей.
the candidate
Однако,
Zelensky.
придя к власти, он
Two-thirds
все эти
of
обещания
voters eventually
забыл
ended up
и
voting
втянулся в
for him.
западную
However, once in
геополитическую
power,
игру
he forgot about all
против
his
России,
promises
и
and let
шанс на
himself be
мир
drawn
был упущен.
into the Western
Что же делать
geopolitical
сейчас,
game against
спрашивают
Russia.
нас многие.
And the chance for peace
Что
was
может
lost.
вернуть мир на Украину?
Many people ask
Мы
us,
уже много
what
раз
can we do
говорили,
now?
что для этого
What can
должны
bring
быть
peace
выполнены
back to
цели нашей
Ukraine? We
специальной
have said
военной
many
операции,
times that to
сформулированные
do
по итогам
this,
8
the
лет
goals of our special
постмайданного
military
развития Украины.
operations
Мы
formulated
готовы
following
сделать
8
это
years
путем
of
переговоров
Ukraine's
и никогда
post-Maidan
от них не
development must be
отказывались, в
met.
отличие от киевского режима,
We are ready to do
который
this through
под наускиванием
negotiations and have
западных
never
кукловодов во
abandoned
главе с
them,
Борисом
unlike the
Джонсоном
Kiev regime, which,
отказался от диалога с
at the
нами
instigation
и
of its
подписания уже
Western puppet
парафированного в
masters,
Стамбуле
helmed
в
by
апреле
Boris Johnson,
2022 года
refused to engage in
соглашения и
dialogue
принял закон,
with us and
запрещающий
to sign the
вести с
agreement
Россией
already
какие-либо
initialed in
переговоры,
Istanbul in April
обрекший на
2022,
гибель
instead
десятки
passing a law
тысяч
prohibiting
несчастных,
negotiations
молодых
with
и не очень
Russia,
молодых украинцев, бросая их в топкую мясорубку,
and condemned
принося
tens
кровавую
of thousands
жертву
of
в
young
годы
and
войны.
not so young Ukrainians to
Но
die
не
in the
стоит
fire
тратить
of
время
this
на пустые
war.
планы киевского режима вести
One should
переговоры
not
на
waste
основе
time
так
on
называемой
Kiev's
формулы мира
futile plans to
Зеленского,
negotiate on
которая
the
является
basis of
ничем иным,
Zelensky's
как
so-called
ультиматумом
peace
России
formula. It is
и
nothing other
попытки
than an
всеми правдами и
ultimatum to
неправдами
Russia
заманить
and an
бесконечные
attempt
заседания на основе этого
to
утопического
lure
проекта как
as
можно
many
больше
countries as
стран.
possible into endless
Эта
meetings
фальшивка уже
on
понятна многим из тех,
this
кто поначалу
utopian
невольно
project
оказался
at any
втянутым в эту
price
лживую
possible.
затею
This
Киева.
fabrication is
Если не
already
будет
clear to
настоящих
many of
переговоров,
those who at
основанных
first
на реальной оценке
unwittingly found
ситуации
themselves
на
drawn
земле,
into
цели
Kiev's
специальной
deceitful
военной
scheme,
операции,
if there are
все
no
равно
real
будут достигнуты.
negotiations based on a
Господин
genuine
председатель,
assessment of
80
the
лет
situation
назад,
on the ground, the goals of
22
the special
февраля
military operation will still
1944
be
года
achieved.
был издан
Mr.
указ,
President, 8 years
приказ о
ago,
награждении командира
on February
минометного
22,
взвода
1944, an
младшего
order was
лейтенанта
issued to
Семена
award
Ивановича
mortar
Зеленского
platoon
орденом
commander,
Красной
junior
Звезды
lieutenant
за доблесть и
Semyon Ivanovich
мужество, проявленные
Zelensky,
в ходе
the Order of
освобождения
the Red
Украины
Star,
от
for the
немецких
valor and
нацистов.
courage he displayed
Ему еще
during
не
the
было 20
liberation
лет.
of Ukraine from the German
Если бы
Nazis.
сегодня он был жив и
He had
захотел
yet
бы
to turn
почтить память
20
своих
years old.
однополчан,
If he
его
were
бы
alive
арестовали,
today and wanted
возможно,
to
избили
honor the
и
memory
бросили
of
бы
his
за
fellow
стенки
soldiers, he would be
СБУ,
arrested,
где замучили бы до
possibly
смерти, как это
beaten,
сделали с американским
and thrown
журналистом Гонсало Лирой.
into the prisons of the
Такой
Ukrainian
режим
security
на
service,
Украине
where he would
установил
be
его
tortured
внук
to death,
Владимир,
as happened to the
который сегодня
American
чествует в
journalist
качестве героев
Gonzalo
нацистских
Lira.
преступников и
This is the
коллаборантов,
regime that was established
уничтоживших
in
в годы
Ukraine by
войны
his
сотни
grandson
тысяч
Vladimir,
евреев,
who today
поляков,
honors
русских
the
и
Nazis.
украинцев. И
Nazi
этот
criminals
режим
and
сегодня
collaborators who
пытается
killed
спасти
hundreds
тех,
of
кто
thousands
80
of
лет
Jews,
назад
Poles,
вместе
Russians,
с
and
нами боролся
Ukrainians
с
during the
нацизмом.
war, to honor them as
Не случайно,
heroes.
не только проигравшие во Второй
And
мировой
today,
войне
those
Германия,
who
Италия и
fought
Япония,
alongside us against
но
the
и весь
Nazis 80
западный
years
лагерь
ago are trying to save
выступает
this
сегодня
regime. It is
против
no
осуждения
coincidence that the
нацизма в
entire Western
Генассамблее.
camp, and not
А те,
only
кто воевал в рядах
Germany,
СС,
Italy, and Japan,
чествуют
who
в
lost in
парламенте
the Second
Канады.
World War, are
Кстати,
opposing
сегодня в
the
России
condemnation
отмечается
of
праздник
Nazis in the
День
General
защитника
Assembly, while
Отечества.
those
В этот
who
день мы
fought
отдаем
with the
дань памяти
Nazis are
всем
being
ветеранам,
extolled.
нашим отцам,
By the way,
дедам
today
и
is a holiday in
прадедам,
Russia
отдавшим свою жизнь,
where we
защищая
honor
Родину.
the defenders of our
Благодаря их
fatherland,
воинским подвигам
the
и отваге
veterans,
наш
fathers, and
народ сокрушил
grandfathers who
нацизм
sacrificed
80
their
лет
lives
назад
defending their
и
homeland. Thanks
сокрушить
to
его
their
и
heroic
сейчас.
feats
С праздником,
and
дорогие
bravery, our
защитники!
nation
Наше
defeated
дело правое,
Nazism
и мы
80
победим.
years ago and is defeating it today. Happy holiday, dear defenders. Our cause is just, and we will prevail. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation, and I now invite His Excellency Xavier Bettel, the Deputy Prime Minister of Luxembourg, to take the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr.
Je dois vous dire
President.
que de parler après
I
le
must tell you
représentant de la
that to
Fédération
speak
de
after the
Russie
representative of the
n'est
Russian
pas tâche
Federation
facile.
is not an easy task.
Je suis venu ici et comme
I've
toujours,
come here
une
as
fois
I
qu'on leur parle,
always,
ils s'en vont.
uh,
Donc ils
do.
prônent le
When I
dialogue,
speak,
mais
they
le
leave.
dialogue de la
They
chaise vide n'est pas
take
facile.
the floor, but then there's an
Monsieur
empty
l'ambassadeur.
chair, and so it's difficult. I
Première
must
chose j'ose vous demander le dialogue.
to have a
Je
dialogue.
fais partie des rares chefs
Well,
de gouvernement
I'm
qui
one of
avaient
the
un
rare heads of
contact
state and government
avec le président
that
Poutine et
had
avec le président Zelensky
contact-
au début du conflit.
had contact with both the
Je l'ai
presidents of
fait.
Russia and Ukraine
Pour avoir
at
un
the
dialogue,
beginning
il
of
faut
the
aussi
conflict. I did that because
avoir
in
une
order to
écoute.
have a dialogue, you
Et je
need
dois vous
to
dire que
listen to people.
même si ça surprend les uns et
And
les
even
autres,
though
que
it
j'avais
might
cette écoute de la part du
surprise some
président
people
Poutine,
that I have President
je l'avais aussi
Putin's
bien sûr
ear,
de la part de Volodymyr
I
Zelensky.
also had President
Mais il faut
Zelensky's
aussi
ear,
qu'après une
of course.
écoute et des engagements, il y ait des
After
résultats.
but after listening, one
Et j'ai vu
needs
que du côté
results,
russe,
and I saw on
la
the
volonté
Russian
de
side
cesser
that
la
the
guerre
willingness to cease
était
the
la
war
dernière de leurs
was
priorités.
the last concern
Et
on their mind.
Boutcha,
and
Irpin,
Butcher.
juste après
Okay.
les discussions où on me dit qu'on veut
And
la
just
paix,
after
était la
discussions,
preuve
I
que
was
ce n'était
told
pas
that they wanted
leur
peace,
volonté.
but what we saw
Donc aujourd'hui, on
showed
se
that
retrouve
that's not
ici
what they had
pour
in mind.
pas
So
célébrer,
today,
car une célébration est quelque chose de heureux,
we are
mais
here,
tout simplement pour montrer
not to
qu'on est du
commemorate
côté de
something,
l'Ukraine. Et pourquoi je suis si
happy.
sensible
We
à
are
cette
here
question,
to
monsieur
show that we are on the
le
side of
représentant de la
Ukraine.
Fédération de Russie, c'est moi-même ayant une grand-mère russe
I
et un grand-père
have,
polonais juif.
a
Et quand vous dites
Russian
ici à cette
grandmother,
tribune qu'il y a des
and,
nazis
when you
à
say that
Kiev,
there are Nazis in Kiev
croyez-moi, il n'y en a
here,
pas plus à
believe
Kiev
me,
qu'à
there are
Moscou
no
ou à
more in
Saint-Pétersbourg.
Kiev than there are
Il
in
est
Moscow or
honteux
St. Petersburg.
de
It
faire
is
croire
shameful
que le
to
régime
make people believe
de
that
l'Ukraine et de
the
Kiev
U-
soutient des
Ukraine
nazis
and
et
Kiev
que l'Ukraine
regime
serait
is
remplie
supporting
de
Nazis,
nazis. Et de
and
vouloir
that
en fait
Ukraine is full of
aujourd'hui
Nazis.
réécrire
And
l'histoire en
today,
disant que
to
vous
try to
protégez
rewrite
la
history
Russie
by
contre
saying
les
that
nazis,
you
parce que
are
vous l'avez fait pendant la
protecting
Deuxième Guerre
Russians
mondiale,
against
c'est ne pas
Nazis,
rendre
given
service et
what
même
you
faire une
did during
honte
the
à ces
Second World
combattants
War.
russes qui sont
That
morts pendant la
is
Deuxième Guerre
not
mondiale.
good for the
Comparer ce qui
memory
est
of the
comparable
Russian fighters
n'est
in the
pas une
Second
attaque
World War.
unilatérale.
This
J'ai,
is not a unilateral attack.
Ici, vous êtes un grand pays.
You're a great
Et je vous l'ai
country.
dit, la question est très
And
sensible
I
pour
say
moi
that
et
this is a
quelque
very
chose qui me tient à
sensitive
cœur. Alors on
issue
essaie
for
de nous
me,
diviser en
that's
Europe,
close to
on
my
essaie de nous
heart.
diviser au
We're
niveau
trying-
mondial.
people
Alors
are
il y a les
trying to
pro-russes,
divide
il y
us
a
in
les
Europe and
pro-russes.
worldwide.
Et je
There
tiens à
are
le dire, je l'ai
pro-Russians,
dit aussi au président
and I said this as
Poutine
well
quand je l'avais
to
en ligne.
President
Il faut
Putin
savoir que ses
when I
meilleurs
spoke to
amis
him,
se trouvent à
that,
Pyongyang
his best friends are in
ou
Pyongyang
en Syrie
or in
ou
Syria
en Iran.
or in Iran.
Ça montre quand même
And
l'isolation de la
that
Russie
shows
par rapport à ce qu'on a
how
connu avant.
Russia is isolated
Cette Russie
compared to
qui,
the Russia
après
that we knew
une
before.
période de communisme,
Russia,
est
which
sortie
after a
et
period of
cherchait
communism,
des partenaires, avait des relations
tried to look
culturelles,
for
des relations
partners, had
politiques, des relations
cultural and
économiques,
political and
des
economic
relations
relations,
amicales avec les
friendly
pays,
relations
se
with other
trouve aujourd'hui
countries. Today,
isolé.
it finds itself
Et je l'ai dit lors de la
isolated.
dernière
And I
réunion
said
que
this
nous
at the
avions
last
chez notre
meeting,
collègue à Skopje,
that we had
que
in
je salue
Skopje,
ici
and
aussi.
I welcome
Je
my
l'ai
colleague
dit
here.
à représentant russe aussi.
I said this to the
Commencer une
Russian
guerre n'est pas une
representative
grandeur
there
en
as well.
politique. C'est terminer
Starting
une guerre
a war
et de savoir
is
quand
not
il est temps
great. Putting
de
an end to a
reconnaître une
war is
erreur qui montre la
greatness,
grandeur
and it's
d'un
time
politique.
to show
Aujourd'hui, nous avions
to
des
recognize
violations
error.
même
And
des fondements de cette
today,
Assemblée. Nous
we
retrouvons
see the
ici,
very
nous venons d'écouter un
foundations of this
discours
assembly. I mean,
qui
we've
montre
just
que
listened to
tous
a speech
propos
that
que l'on peut
shows that
avoir sont
anything
déplacés
that
par
we
rapport aux
might
propos
say
qui ont été faits de la partie russe,
is
qui ne correspondent
really
pas à la
out
réalité.
of
Et on ne
line
peut
with
pas
what Russia
réécrire
has said,
l'histoire
which is not
au lieu de
reality. You
reconnaître tout
can't
simplement
rewrite history.
une erreur.
You
De dire que
simply
vous
need to recognize an error,
défendez la
to say that you
population
are defending
russe, que
the
vous voulez
Russian
défendre
population, that
aujourd'hui
you
presque
want to
l'Europe
defend today,
contre
well,
des
Europe
nazis en Ukraine,
against Nazis
alors
in
que le
Ukraine,
résultat est qu'aujourd'hui
when
les
the
voisins
result
de
today
l'Ukraine
is that the
tremblent. Les
neighbors
voisins,
of
que ce soit les
Ukraine
pays
are
baltes, que ce
trembling.
soit les pays, la
The
Pologne,
Baltic
la
countries,
Roumanie,
or
que ce
Poland,
soit la
or
Moldavie, la
Romania, or
Géorgie,
Moldavia,
sont des pays qui ont
Georgia,
peur de
these are
l'agresseur russe
countries that are
et qui ne dorment
afraid
plus
of
tranquillement
Russia
du
and
fait
that
que la Russie est
can't,
devenue un pays
sleep at night now because Russia has
imprévisible,
become
un pays
an
dangereux,
unpredictable,
un pays
dangerous
qui
country. A country which
ne respecte aucun droit
does not respect
qu'on aimerait pourtant
any
voir respecter,
any
qui sont
law that
pour
we
nous
would like to see
une des choses
respected.
les plus importantes. Et vous l'avez dit, monsieur
That's the most
l'ambassadeur de
important
Russie
thing. And you
aussi,
said this,
qu'il
Russian
était
ambassador, as
important
well, that it's
de
important
retrouver ces
to,
territoires russes. Mais on ne fait pas les
recover these
frontières
Russian
pendant la
territories,
nuit,
but
dans un
you
cauchemar ou
don't,
dans un rêve, à
make
redéfinir des nouvelles
borders
frontières.
overnight and
Le
try
droit
to
international
redesign
fait que les
things.
frontières sont
International law
préétablies.
means
Et on ne
that
décide pas parce qu'on est plus
borders
grand,
are
parce qu'on est plus
pre-established.
fort,
It's
que
not
l'on va
because you're bigger and
redéfinir
stronger that
la
you
taille de son
can
pays et prendre quelque
redefine
chose
the
à
size
quelqu'un.
of your
Je
country
l'ai
and take
connu, moi, au
something from
Grand-Duché de
someone else.
Luxembourg,
I
monsieur le
mean,
Président.
I had that
Je
experience
viens
in
d'un
the
pays qui
Grand
avait un
Duchy of
voisin
Luxembourg.
plus grand, plus
We
fort
had a
qu'était
bigger
l'Allemagne.
neighbor, Germany.
Aujourd'hui, l'Allemagne est mon partenaire, l'Allemagne est
now we
mon
are
ami,
partners with
l'Allemagne
Germany.
est mon
We're friends with
voisin.
Germany.
L'Allemagne
We're
est celui avec qui je veux
neighbours.
construire quelque chose.
We want to build something together with them.
Réalisez ce que vous êtes en train de faire.
Just realize
J'ai
what
eu M.
you are
Poutine
doing.
plusieurs fois en ligne, je fais partie et je vais peut-être choquer l'un ou l'autre. Le jour
Now,
où vous comprendrez que vous avez
I've
fait une
spoken
erreur,
to
que vous êtes
Putin
prêt
several times,
à retourner autour de la
and I
table,
said, when
il
you're
peut contacter. Je
prepared
fais
to
partie de
come
ces gens qui
to the
sont prêts à
negotiating
lui
table,
parler, mais
we
qu'ils
are prepared
reconnaissent
to talk
les
to
erreurs
you.
qu'il a faites.
But you need
Mais
to
qu'on
recognize
arrête
the
de
mistakes
tuer
that you have made. You
des
need to stop
générations, de
killing
priver des enfants
generations,
d'éducation, car aujourd'hui les enfants
depriving
ne peuvent
children of
plus
education.
avoir
I
une
mean,
éducation
children today
normale.
can't
Et
have a
comment
normal education.
expliquerez-vous à
And
ces
how
femmes, à
will
ces
you
enfants, à
explain
ces
to those
mères
women and
russes
those children,
que
those
vous avez
Russian
envoyé
mothers,
leurs enfants
that you have sent
à
their
l'abattoir,
children to
tout
the
simplement pour
abattoir
une erreur que
to
vous
be
avez
slaughtered
commise?
just because of a
Comment
mistake that you
l'inscrirez-vous dans les livres d'histoire? Est-ce que ce sera de nouveau quelque chose qui sera supprimé des news, de l'actualité en Russie parce que ça gêne les uns ou les autres? L'impunité aussi est quelque chose que l'on doit toujours se rappeler. On ne peut pas agresser quelqu'un en se disant qu'il ne se passera rien après. Vous savez qu'aujourd'hui, vos soutiens sont de plus en plus faibles, de plus en plus réduits. Moi, je peux juste vous dire que
l'Ukraine
more reduced in
est un
number
pays qui
today.
est agressé.
Ukraine is a
Il y a un
country
agresseur,
that's been
c'est la Russie,
attacked, and the attacker
que
is
nous continuerons à
Russia. And we
soutenir
will continue to
l'Ukraine,
support
que nous
Ukraine.
continuerons à soutenir
We will
les
continue
collègues
to
qui,
support
aujourd'hui,
the,
sont victimes de votre agression.
colleagues today
Mais
that are being
réalisez un
subject
jour
to this
que
aggression.
vous avez peut-être pensé
But
que les
realize
Ukrainiens, quand j'étais
one day,
là-bas sur place,
when
quand
I
vous
was
allez
there,
en Ukraine,
when you go to Ukraine,
reconnaissons aussi la force des
you
Ukrainiens.
see the strength
Beaucoup
of
d'entre nous ont cru
Ukrainians.
que
A lot
l'Ukraine,
of
ça
us
lui durerait
thought
3 ou 4 jours
that,
et puis ce serait terminé,
Ukraine
que la
would
Russie allait les
fold
terrasser.
and that Russia was
Les
going
Ukrainiens
to
se
just
battent.
steamroller them.
Mais ils
But
se
no,
battent pas
they're
que pour eux.
fighting, and they're not
Ils
just
se battent
fighting
aussi
for
pour nous.
themselves, they're
Merci, Monsieur
also
le Président.
fighting for us. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Luxembourg, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Slovenia, Her Excellency Tanja Fajon, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Affairs, to take the podium.
Thank you, Mr. President. These days we are marking the 2nd anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and almost 10 years since the destabilization of the region has begun with the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. The 2nd and 10th anniversary are an opportunity to recap what the UN and its member states can do in order to stabilize the region and bring just and lasting peace to Ukraine. There have been many discussions about what can be done and what should be done in this respect. Allow me to present Slovenia's take in few points. 1, peace. Peace should come to Ukraine. It may seem impossible at times, but it will happen. What we can do to expedite it is to support the peace process that is taking shape within Ukraine's peace formula. Russia needs to do its part. Russia must stop the aggression and immediately and unconditionally withdraw from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Its war rhetoric and threats need to cease. Another important step towards peace where we can aid Ukraine is to support global and regional initiatives aimed at providing a stable foothold for its reconstruction and environmental recovery. Slovenia is gravely concerned with existing environmental impacts of the war and is dreading potential ones. All of us can continue to support the EIEA and its efforts to prevent a nuclear accident in Ukraine. 2, international humanitarian law should and must be respected. With all the ruined homes, hospitals, and schools, and with civilian casualties on the rise for the consecutive months, this is obviously not the case. If lasting peace is to come to Ukraine, accountability needs to be assured. What we can do in this respect is to lay the groundwork for justice to be served in the future. We can support the strengthening of the international legal framework and assist in the establishment of the Special Tribunal on the crime of aggression against Ukraine. The recently signed Ljubljana, the Hague Convention, is an important complementary mechanism responding to violations by fighting impunity and promoting accountability for the most serious international crimes. And 3, the humanitarian situation should be addressed. We are witnessing the largest humanitarian crisis in Europe since World War II. An estimated 14.6 million Ukrainians will need humanitarian assistance in 2024. And we should take care that it reaches as many as possible, especially in light of increasing needs in other crisis areas around the world, such as Gaza. Slovenia will do its part. At the same time, 30% of Ukraine is contaminated with landmines, the highest percentage of any country in the world. We see humanitarian demining as a vital step towards normalization and economic recovery of the country. Mr. President, let me conclude with the following. There is no room for double standards. No one should ignore violations of international law, neither in Ukraine nor in Gaza. We will not allow undermining of international organizations. We will not allow undermining of our institutions. We demand respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law across the board by everyone, everywhere, and at all the time. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Slovenia, and I now invite Her Excellency Helena Carreras, the Minister of National Defense of Poland, no? Portugal, to take the floor.
President, I welcome the opportunity to address the General Assembly on the situation of the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. It has now been 10 years since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and 2 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. More than 700 days of death and destruction have passed. More than 700 days of a war that has taken its toll on innocent civilians, with a disproportionate burden inflicted on women, children, and the elderly. More than 700 days of human suffering, death, injury, displacement, loss of critical infrastructure, reduced access to healthcare and education, and curtailment of human rights and fundamental freedoms. On this somber date, we cannot and will not fail to reiterate our resolute and unwavering condemnation of Russia's unprovoked, illegal, and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine, which constitutes a blatant violation of international law for which it must be held fully accountable. From the outset, Portugal has been unequivocal about where we stand, side by side with Ukraine in the defense of rules, principles, and values that should guide us all. Rules, principles, and values that are enshrined in the UN Charter. We are part of the overwhelming majority of this General Assembly, which has voted in favor of 6 resolutions condemning the invasion and calling for the end of Russia's war of aggression. Our support is comprehensive, be it on the political, financial, humanitarian, and also at the military level. We will continue to assist the brave Ukrainian armed forces in exercising its legitimate right to self-defense against an illegal aggression. We have welcomed nearly 6,000 refugees in Portugal while focusing on reconstruction efforts, such as in the case of the public school system of the Ukrainian city of Zhytomyr. But this discussion is not just about Ukraine. It is about upholding the respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. We cannot remain on the sidelines while the most fundamental principles of the international legal and security order are blatantly disregarded. None of us can feel safe until this war ends. This can only happen with a comprehensive and just solution that is in accordance with the UN Charter and in line with Ukraine's peace formula. But let us recall that any such solution cannot fail to consider the occupied territories of Crimea and Donbas since 2014. Allow me to be very clear. We do not recognize these illegal annexation attempts. Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson are part of Ukraine. The report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, dated last October, gives us an appalling picture of the situation in terms of human rights and highlights the many cases of torture and violence, including sexual violence, perpetrated against civilians with a disproportionate impact on women, children, and older persons. That is why we support every action being taken by the International Criminal Court to hold accountable those responsible for these atrocities and to ensure justice for all the victims. Portugal also participates in the core group for accountability of Russia's aggression against Ukraine and support the Council of Europe's Register of Damage. The humanitarian crisis caused by this war has to end. President, when I visited Kyiv on February 2023, on the first anniversary of the Russian invasion, it was impossible to remain indifferent to the bravery of a people besieged by an unscrupulous aggressor. This bravery only found correspondence in the unshakable confidence of a nation determined to defeat a brutal and unjustified invasion. The remarkable resilience of Ukrainian men and women and their will to prevail are an inspiration to the world and a lesson to the aggressor. Yet, the impacts of this war are not confined to Europe. Russia's aggression has a direct effect on the global food, energy, and financial crisis, with severe impacts on the most vulnerable countries. The role of the UN Secretary General in mitigating these effects has proven invaluable. But this situation cannot be tolerated, and we will continue to support all collective efforts in this regard. We know that other pressing crises around the world require our attention and our action, but we need to be coherent, and therefore we cannot fail the people of Ukraine. So, together, united, we must remain unwavering in our support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished Minister of National Defense of Portugal. And I now invite His Excellency Buhar Usmani, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of North Macedonia, to take the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome the opportunity to address the General Assembly on this important occasion as we mark 2 years of Russia's full-scale invasion of its neighbor. 2 years, a war of aggression in Europe in the 21st century. 2 years of Russia's continued attempt to influence, interfere, and disrupt democracies and democratic processes across Europe. And 2 full years of death, destruction, and human suffering. Excellencies, I urge Russia once again to end this senseless war and withdraw its troops from the sovereign territory of Ukraine. Russia violated the basic principles of international law and UN Charter and launched a fully fledged war of aggression against Ukraine, a UN member state, and a peaceful neighbor. We condemn and reject the attempted illegal annexation by Russia of Ukraine's territories, as we have witnessed since 2014 with the occupation of Crimea and Sevastopol. Furthermore, Russia has committed a wide range of violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, which have been documented by international monitoring mechanisms alleging war crimes. North Macedonia is also strongly concerned and condemns Russia's unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia and Belarus, and calls upon them to ensure their safe return. Mr. President, the war of aggression against Ukraine stands in stark contrast to our shared commitment to peace, human rights, and fundamental freedoms, shaking security fundaments of Europe. This war has changed our way of life and challenged the very essence of the word freedom. Along with our strong condemnations of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, we concurrently condemn Russia's continuous attempts to interfere, influence, and disrupt democracies and democratic processes across Europe. While we are witnessing a full-scale war against Ukraine, in parallel, we are observing ongoing hybrid threats across Europe's regions and in Balkans also. The hybridity of Russia's hostile campaigns beyond Ukraine diverge from region to region, but the pattern and the anticipated end results are identical, generating instability and chaos. Russia, through its known hybrid means, is present in every societal pore. In North Macedonia and across our region, in the heart of Europe, we feel the adversity and the negative effects of this strategic influence. The security risks for Europe are imminent. It's clear, lingering threat to the whole of Europe, and we must say no to Russia's hostile campaign. Our response to this is defining our own future trajectory. Our response is clear: no to Russia, yes to Europe, strong, united, and integrated. Our shared no to Russia has to be loud, resolute, and consistent. It is our duty to expose Russia across the multilateral space and to keep insisting on moral, legal, and political accountability, to disarm and dismantle the system of disinformation and false narratives, to separate good from bad, truth from lies, right from wrong. Our country belongs and stands aside with the rest of the free world that believes in the ideals of peace, liberty, and democracy, fully aware and cognizant of the ultimate value and importance of these differences. North Macedonia is a functional multi-ethnic democracy resting on solid foundations. Our past and present speaks of a resilient society capable to withstand different trials and challenges. Mr. President, we must say no to Russia for the sake of the new generations, so they can live in peace, freed from fear of war and distrustful sense of insecurity, that the destiny of the Ukrainians could one day be their own. We reiterate the importance of investigating the war crimes on the territory of Ukraine, and North Macedonia will continue to engage in the work of the core group on options for the establishment of a tribunal on the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Excellencies, the discussion in this plenary is not only about Ukraine, but about each and every country present in the General Assembly. It is about respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states who rely on the norms and principles of international law and observe the Charter of the United Nations. It is about our shared democratic values and interests. It is about the sovereign rights of each state to choose its future. It is about the sovereign right of each state to defend itself against aggression. And the Russian Federation, a P5 member, violated these fundamental principles cherished by all and agreed upon by all. I call you to stand united and support Ukraine. Thank you so much.
I thank His Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of North Macedonia, and I now invite His Excellency Gordan Grilic Radman, the Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of Croatia, to take the podium.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. After 2 long and painful years, Russia is still conducting its brutal military aggression against Ukraine. Such flagrant breach of international law and the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter is an affront to the fundamental values of peace, security, and respect for the sovereignty of all nations. This aggression brings us to the brink of breaking the global system as a whole, endangering the ideas of freedom, sovereignty, and independence. We call on Russia to cease all combat operations and withdraw its troops from Ukraine. We regret the tremendous loss of all life resulting from Russia's senseless war and reaffirm our steadfast support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Mr. President, the much desired peace can only be lasting if it is just. For peace to be just, it has to be anchored in accountability. For this reason, accountability for crimes committed in Ukraine must be upheld not only because it provides justice to the victims, but also because it helps prevent future atrocities. With this in mind, Croatia supports efforts to promote accountability for international crimes committed in and against Ukraine in all relevant multilateral fora, including the International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice. We have stood by Ukraine and its people from day one. We have provided aid, and over 25,000 Ukrainians have found temporary protection in Croatia. Croatia herself was a victim of aggression and has had war on her soil. Following our own painful experience, today we not only understand but strongly support and participate in all initiatives aimed at relieving the suffering of the Ukrainian population, especially the weakest and the most vulnerable ones. Besides the energy crisis, one of the most dramatic effects of the Russian aggression is the threat of food shortage looming over large parts of the world. Ukraine needs our collective support in its demining efforts. Croatia herself, with vast experience in demining her own territory, will remain committed to national and international actions in addressing the security and humanitarian concerns posed by these weapons and their indiscriminate use. Landmines in Ukraine are not just a Ukrainian or a European problem. Just like the current war, they have a global impact. Much of the world's most fertile land will remain contaminated by them for decades to come. In that regard, the global food supply, and with it our global security, will remain hindered and disrupted. In this vein, Croatia hosted the first ever high-level international donors conference on humanitarian demining in Ukraine in October 2023 in Zagreb. This conference, co-organized by the governments of Croatia and Ukraine, confirmed the support to Ukraine's demining efforts by 34 participating countries, pledging €500 million overall. Croatia will continue to support Ukraine. The aggression against Ukraine concerns us all in all corners of the world. Our collective efforts to achieve just and lasting peace in Ukraine must be redoubled. I assure you, Mr. President, of Croatia's unwavering commitment to this common task. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of Croatia, and I now invite His Excellency Ignacio Cassi, the head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, to the podium.
Merci, Monsieur le Président,
Thank you,
Excellences,
Mr. President,
Mesdames et Messieurs.
ladies and gentlemen.
Le 24 février
On the 24th
2022,
of February
il y a 2 ans,
2022, 2 years ago,
nous nous sommes
we
éveillés
woke
en
up
Suisse
in
et en
Switzerland
toute
and
l'Europe
across Europe
dans un cauchemar.
to a nightmare.
Ce lointain spectre
The
de la
distant
guerre
spectre of
s'était
war
soudainement
had
matérialisé
suddenly
devant
materialized
nous.
before our very eyes.
Toutes les précautions prises
All the
pendant
precautions
75
taken over
ans pour
75
prévenir
years to
la
prevent
répétition
a
des
repetition
tragédies du
of the
XXe
tragedies of
siècle
the 20th century
semblaient
suddenly
soudainement
seemed
vaines.
futile.
Ni le multilatéralisme,
Neither
ni le droit
multilateralism
international
nor
public
public
ne
international
semblaient
law
capables de
seemed
résister
capable
à la
of
force militaire.
withstanding military force.
Après le choc initial,
After the initial shock
après l'incrédulité
and
face à des images
after the
aussi horribles,
disbelief
nous
at
avons
such
commencé à nous
horrific
interroger.
images, we began to
Comment
wonder,
cela
how
a-t-il été rendu possible?
was this possible?
Entre-temps, des milliers de vies ont été
In the
perdues.
meantime, thousands of lives
Des
have
millions
been
de
lost.
personnes ont
Millions
été
of
déplacées.
people have been displaced,
D'innombrables
and
familles
countless
ont
families
été
have been
déchirées
torn
par
apart
ces événements
by
tragiques.
these tragic events.
Aujourd'hui, je tiens à réitérer
Today,
notre
I would
pleine
like to
solidarité
reiterate our
avec le
full
peuple
solidarity
ukrainien
with the Ukrainian
qui
people
traverse
who
cette
are
catastrophe.
going through this catastrophe.
Il est certainement contre-productif de simplement s'apitoyer sur leur sort ou de se sentir impuissant. Je suis fermement convaincu que nous devons trouver la détermination nécessaire pour agir, pour revitaliser les outils à notre disposition dans le but de mettre un terme aux violations flagrantes du droit international et des droits de l'homme. Ici, mesdames et messieurs, ici au siège de l'ONU, nous avons le devoir de respecter le mandat confié par cette Assemblée, assurer au peuple des nations le droit de vivre en paix. Cela implique de restaurer la paix et la justice en Ukraine. Mesdames et messieurs, le chemin qui amène à la paix tient dans une main. Il s'agit de notre charte. Il tient dans une main. Égalité souveraine entre les États, respect de l'intégrité territoriale, interdiction du recours à la force. Voilà. Pas plus difficile que ça. Tout est là, dans ce texte fondamental, garant de nos valeurs universelles et de l'ordre multilatéral. Cette Assemblée a toujours tenu le cap. C'était le cas lors de la résolution en faveur d'une paix juste, globale et durable en Ukraine, adoptée ici dans cette salle le 23 février de l'année passée par une large majorité d'entre nous. Et pourtant, nous devons le constater, l'horizon ukrainien reste bouché malgré notre unité affichée dans cette salle. Sur la voie de la paix, nous n'avons pas encore trouvé d'unité. La Suisse est déterminée à y contribuer, déterminée à contribuer non seulement à la paix, mais également à protéger les civils vulnérables aux effets dévastateurs de la guerre. Nous persévérons sans relâche dans notre engagement en faveur du respect des conventions de Genève. Depuis 1864, véritable pilier du droit international humanitaire dont vous le savez, la Suisse est garante. À Genève, il y a exactement 160 ans, naissait la première convention sur le droit international humanitaire. Et il y a exactement 75 ans, la quatrième convention. Cet anniversaire devrait nous inciter à réfléchir. Après 160 ans, nous n'avons toujours pas véritablement appris. La recherche d'une voie réaliste vers la paix en Ukraine demeure un objectif primordial pour mon pays. À la demande de l'Ukraine, nous avons l'intention d'organiser d'ici cet été une conférence de haut niveau pour la paix en Ukraine. Je saisis donc cette opportunité qui m'est offerte aujourd'hui pour inviter toutes les nations, vous tous, du nord au sud, de l'est à l'ouest, vous invitez à coopérer à notre objectif commun, trouver un terrain d'entente pour la paix en Ukraine et reprendre le chemin tracé par notre charte. Mesdames et messieurs, restons des nations unies et ne nous laissons pas entraîner dans la spirale de la force militaire ni dans la tentation du pouvoir qui nous transforme en puissance désunie. Je vous remercie.
I thank the head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, and I now invite His Excellency Radoslaw Sikorski, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, to the podium.
President. Excellencies, on the 21st of February 2022, 3 days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Kenya's permanent representative to the UN, Ambassador Martin Kimani, spoke in the Security Council. In his short but remarkable speech, the ambassador talked about African countries' borders, inherited from the colonial empires, drawn with no regard for the existing nations and cultures. It certainly did not make life any easier for the inhabitants of those states. They could look backward and pursue racial, ethnic, or religious homogeneity and plunge into long-lasting conflicts. But they took a different path. Let me quote Ambassador Kimani. "We agreed that we would settle for the borders that we inherited, but we would still pursue continental, political, economic, and legal integration. We chose to follow the rules of the Organization of African Unity and the United Nations Charter, not because our borders satisfied us, but because we wanted something greater, forged in peace." End of quote. I remain grateful for these inspiring remarks. The courageous vision of the Kenyan ambassador contrasts starkly with the path chosen by the Russian Federation. Despite being a permanent Security Council member, Russia has repeatedly violated the UN Charter. It's trying to crush a sovereign state and exterminate its cultural identity. It shocked the world with brutality unseen for decades. We will never forget the atrocities committed in Bucha, Mariupol, or Kramatorsk. It decided to block the transport of grain and to use food as a weapon, even though the number of people suffering from hunger is growing at an alarming rate. Today, on the eve of the second anniversary of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin shows no intention to change the course, quite the reverse. The aggression resonates globally, causing economic turbulence that affects us all. 2 years ago, the General Assembly adopted the resolution condemning Russia's violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity. It demanded that Russia immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its military forces from Ukraine within the internationally recognized borders. 141 United Nations members stood up for Ukraine and against the breach of the international order. As we expressed our position clearly and reiterated it on several other occasions in the General Assembly, we committed ourselves to support the victim. We must fulfill this commitment. We must restore the world based on the principles of sovereignty of nations, inviolability of the borders, and respect for personal freedoms. We must hold the perpetrators and their accomplices accountable for their crimes. Only our resolve can deter the neo-imperial delusions that may arise in any part of the world. We need to stay the course until Mr. Putin understands that the days of European imperialism are gone for good. Thank you.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, and I now invite His Excellency David Cameron, Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom, to take the podium.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today, I want to cover 3 points. First, the history. 2 years ago, Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But let's go back a little further. In 2008, I visited Tbilisi in Georgia, shortly after Russian forces invaded South Ossetia. I said then that if we did not stand up to Putin, he would be back for more. In 2014, I was Prime Minister as his little green men seized control of Crimea. I said again that if we did not stand up to Putin, he would be back for more. Now, having tried and failed to conquer all of Ukraine, the lesson of this history is clear. If we do not stand up to Putin, he will be back for more. Compared to 2008 and 2014, I do believe the world has started properly to wake up to Putin's menace. Yet here is the tragedy of it all. Prior to 2014, did Ukraine pose a threat to Russia? No. Did Russia object to the formation of the Ukrainian state in 1991? No. Did it in 1994 when signing the Budapest Memorandum? No. In fact, Russia pledged never to use force against Ukraine. If the Ukrainian state was such a threat to Russian-speaking residents, why did every region of Ukraine vote for independence, Crimea and the Donbass included? Cut through ludicrous accusations of Nazism against a state with a Jewish president, and what are you left with? Nothing but the ahistorical claim that Ukraine's very existence is anti-Russian, a claim which runs contrary to the principle of self-determination, one of the foundations of the United Nations. Putin tries to claim that Russia is fighting not against Ukraine, but against the whole of the West. He claims we are somehow out to dismember Russia. That is the central lie of this war. The truth is that we, myself included, spent years trying to build a new relationship with Moscow after the end of the Cold War. We did that because we profoundly believe that a secure, stable Russia, at peace with its neighbors, is in our interests and the world's. It is a tragedy that Putin prefers to hark back to the 9th century to justify aggression rather than taking up this offer of a different path. And turning to the consequences of all this, the scenes in territories liberated from Russia defy belief. Take Bucha, as has just been said. Mutilated bodies of civilians with hands bound, shot at close range. A children's center turned into a torture chamber. The rape of teenage girls. Disturbing radio intercepts of Russian soldiers referring to this as cleansing. Or consider places still held by Russia. Business gone. Independent media quashed. The rights of minorities, such as the Crimean Tatars, denied. Sinister re-education centers. Forcible deportations, with children torn from their parents to be raised as Russians. Ukrainians forced to accept Russian passports or drafted to fight for Putin. Citizens forced to vote in sham referendums, and now, outrageously, Russian presidential elections held on Ukrainian territory. Crimea, in particular, now far more dependent on Moscow for budget support than it ever was to Kyiv. Invasion has brought these regions neither peace nor prosperity, and nor has Putin's gambit benefited Russians. No Russian soldier had died fighting Ukraine before 2014. Now they have suffered over 300,000 casualties. Moreover, since the invasion, Russia has suffered its first attempted coup in over 3 decades and its first debt default for over a century. Nor has the rest of the world been spared the consequences of this war. Rising energy and food costs have fueled inflation. This has had consequences, especially for the world's poorest. And this leads to my final point, why we must stay strong. 2 years on, I recognize some want to rethink. There is a sense of fatigue. There are other problems. A compromise might seem attractive. But this is wrong. We must recognize the cost of giving up. Putin has said there will be no peace until Russia's goals are achieved. And in his recent interview, he studiously avoided confirming he was satisfied with the land seized from Ukraine at present. This is not a man seeking compromise. Rather, this is a neo-imperialist bully who believes that might is right. And an unjust peace now merely invites a return to fighting in Ukraine when it suits him. But ultimately, we must stay strong, not only for the sake of Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine has been wronged. Yes, we admire their decision to pursue a democratic path and fight for their right to do so. But crucially, we also know that this matters to all of us. If Putin were to eke out some kind of win, the rest of the world would suffer too. What starts in Ukraine would not end there. Putin could easily apply his distortions of history elsewhere, such as Moldova or the Baltic states, and others will be emboldened to turn to fighting when it suits them. No country with a large aggressive neighbor would be safe. And that leads to the other great lie. Russia poses as a friend of those who feel cut out by the international system, but it has shown no interest in changes to make it fairer, such as Security Council reform. It does virtually nothing to support the key funds to back the poorest in our world, such as Gavi or the Global Fund, or IDA under the World Bank. And its actions in Ukraine are so brazen so as to threaten the system itself. So yes, we should stand by Ukraine, but not just for Ukraine, not just for Europe, but for the world and a simple principle: the security of borders, the sanctity of nations, the principle of self-determination. Ukraine's fight is our fight, the world's fight, and the world must stay strong. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom, and I now invite His Excellency Gabrielius Landsbergis, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, to take the podium.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, tomorrow we will mark 2 years since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In fact, Russia's aggression against Ukraine began a decade ago with Russia's occupation and illegal annexation of Crimea, the city of Sevastopol, as well as destabilization of Ukraine's Donbas region. We failed to stop Russia back then, and we can see where it brought us. Russia will not stop unless it is stopped. This genocidal war has many objectives: to erase Ukraine as a sovereign country and proud nation from European map, to threaten European security, and to undermine the rules-based international order. The impact of Russia's aggression reaches countries far beyond Ukrainian borders. We've seen how energy prices, food security, and migration are instrumentalized by Russia and its accomplice, Belarus. We've seen how Russia's disruption of Ukraine's exports through Black Sea ports impacted vulnerable populations globally. It is a global issue, not only a European war. If Russia is allowed to continue unabated in Ukraine today, its war will very soon creep into everyone else's backyard. Rogue players across the world will feel emboldened to settle their own issues their own way. Ukraine must receive all possible military, diplomatic, and economic support. Russia and Belarus must face isolation for their contempt for the very core principles on which the United Nations base their existence. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most serious threat to the global peace and to the integrity of the entire UN system. If Russia is allowed to continue violating international law with no accountability, including for its crime of aggression, I do not see how we can still sit here in these halls and discuss other issues of today or the future. I do not know what would the future hold if we close our eyes before the genocidal assault by the Russian Federation on Ukrainian children, their illegal deportation to Russia and Belarus, their forced separation from families aimed at erasing their Ukrainian identity. As Russian troops continue attacking Ukraine in several directions, as we receive new and new evidence of Ukrainian war prisoners being executed by Russian occupying forces, as Russia organizes its presidential election in the territories of Ukraine occupied by it, Russian representatives continue exploiting and testing the limits of the international system, continue being elected to governing bodies and positions at the international organizations. That is not the way it should be. Colleagues, today's Russia is driven by revanchism and neocolonial expansionist instincts of the last unreconstructed empire. Kremlin is not interested in peace unless it can dictate its terms. If anyone still have doubts what Russia is capable of, the tragic fate of Alexei Navalny in a Russian prison serves as yet another sobering illustration of the ruthless suppression of dissent and of the alarming pace at which Russia continues its descent into totalitarianism. The body of Alexei must be released to his family without any further delay and any additional conditions. Russia must immediately halt its persecution of political figures, release political prisoners, and cease exploitation of the judicial system for political purposes. Kremlin, renowned for its persistent dissemination of a distorted historical narrative, has recently augmented its actions by including a number of Baltic and Polish officials into a so-called list of wanted criminals. These officials have become targets due to their outspoken opposition to Russia's historic revanchonism. Russia must stop such activities. Ladies and gentlemen, Ukraine has proposed a clear path to peace, the 10-point peace formula. We urge all nations support this initiative and to not fall into the trap of the so-called peace plans that only aim Ukraine would succumb to the aggressor's agenda. Finally, let me express an honest hope that majority of nations gathered in this hall share the imperative to collectively uphold the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, reaffirming our unwavering commitment to the victory of the just and not the aggressor. An end to this war is possible, but genuine peace cannot be attained through the Russian deceit. The only real path to an enduring peace goes via Ukraine's victory and Russia's defeat. Thank you.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, and I now invite Her Excellency Annalena Baerbock, Federal Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, to the podium.
I'm afraid the world will forget about us, because everyone is so focused on Russia's war and the violence in the Middle East. That's what a woman my age in Gorom in South Sudan told me. This woman has fled the violence in Sudan with only a small bag of belongings, carrying her child on her hip. Her words have not left me since. And I know that they ring true for countless women, children, and men around the world who go to bed hungry, who suffer violence. As I stand here, I say straight out, we have not forgotten about you. The fact that Russia's brutal war against Ukraine has been raging for 2 years does not mean that we do not see the suffering of others. A schoolgirl deported from the eastern territory of Ukraine, torn away from her mother, is a child who suffers. A toddler in Gaza who has lost his parents is a child who suffers. A boy in Sudan who is hungry is a child who suffers. Every life matters in equal measure. Humanity is indivisible. The worst thing we could do so now is to play off one person's pain against another's. We would only play into the hands of those who seek to divide us, to push their ruthless agenda in the world. That is why it is nothing but cynical when at the G20 meeting in Rio just 2 days ago, the Russian foreign minister openly asked why the world is so preoccupied with Russia's war against Ukraine. Well, Ms. Lavrov, we are preoccupied with your war because your war is causing death, pain, and destruction. Not just in Ukraine, not just in Bucha and Irpin in the eastern territories of Ukraine, but around the whole world. Russia has bombed ports in Ukraine on purpose to prevent Ukrainian grain from being exported to the world, using on purpose food as a weapon. And this could stop tomorrow if the Russian president were to end this war now. If we care about a world in which every life matters in equal measures, it is up to us and every one of us to stand up against Russia's war. The United Nations was founded for exact that purpose, to make sure a life is alive, that humanity is indivisible. President Putin has proved again and again that to him, human lives count for nothing, neither abroad nor at home, where he now doesn't even shy away from arresting its own children, Russian children, for laying down flowers to mourn the death of Alexei Navalny. As I explained to the women in South Sudan, we did not choose to be so preoccupied with Russia's war of aggression. It's the Russian president's ruthless actions that are forcing us. But that doesn't mean that we do not see the suffering in Sudan, that we don't see the suffering in the Middle East. Like many of you, the devastating humanitarian situation in Gaza is keeping us awake at night. 17,000 children left without a mother or a father. Hundreds of thousands desperate for food and water. This suffering needs to end now. We need Hamas to release all the men, women, and children it took hostage in its ruthless attack on Israel on October 7th. We need a humanitarian pause to work towards a sustainable ceasefire, to find a path towards a life in dignity, peace, and security for both Israelis and Palestinians in 2 states. I know that this conflict has stirred up intense emotions in many of our countries. That is why it's so important not to give in to those who try to play off one person's pain against another's. Political leadership means standing up to polarization, to protect our society from the poison of dehumanization. That is the message to send today here at our General Assembly. We stand with Ukraine as long as it takes, because we stand against a world of ruthlessness. We stand for a world in which a life is alive, whether Palestinian, Israeli, Sudanese, or Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the Federal Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, and I now invite His Excellency Stéphane Séjourné, the Minister of European and Foreign Affairs of France, to the podium.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs les ministres, Mesdames les ambassadrices, Messieurs les ambassadeurs, Mesdames et Messieurs, en vos grades et qualités, la Russie agresse depuis 2 ans son voisin et inflige depuis 2 ans les pires souffrances à sa population. Cette guerre d'agression ne concerne pas seulement l'Ukraine, elle emporte des graves conséquences pour toutes nos populations. Cela fait 2 ans aussi que la Russie aggrave la crise alimentaire, qu'elle fait consciemment le choix de nourrir son effort de guerre plutôt que d'aider les populations qui en ont besoin, le choix de prendre pour cible et de pilonner chaque jour le système agricole ukrainien, celui d'essayer de bloquer le transport des céréales en mer Noire. Le choix fait par la Russie, c'est donc le choix de ralentir et d'appauvrir l'aide humanitaire, c'est le choix d'affamer. Personne n'est dupe. Ce n'est pas l'envoi ponctuel l'été dernier de quelques cargaisons qui comportera l'immense dommage et fera office d'une véritable lutte contre la faim en Afrique et sur d'autres continents. Laisser la Russie gagner, c'est la laisser détruire l'agriculture ukrainienne et voler les terres aux Ukrainiens. C'est faire gagner la faim. La Russie n'aide pas les pays du Sud. La Russie n'aide pas les pays du Sud. Et encore moins ces populations, bien au contraire. Et nous devons ici, dans cette instance, le dire clairement. L'insécurité alimentaire, c'est aussi joint à l'insécurité énergétique. La Russie a pendant 2 ans menacé les approvisionnements énergétiques et bien sûr, sans jamais le moindre égard pour le changement climatique, la guerre d'agression russe contre l'Ukraine est donc bien une affaire de tous. Elle nous concerne tous aussi parce qu'elle est illégale et injustifiée. Au sein de cette Assemblée, nous sommes une écrasante majorité à vouloir la paix et la sécurité internationale. Cette majorité compte presque 3/4 de notre Assemblée. Et cette majorité n'est pas silencieuse. En 2 ans, 6 fois, l'Assemblée générale a demandé le respect de la souveraineté, de l'indépendance, de l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine, celui de la Charte des Nations Unies. En octobre 2022, notre Assemblée avait d'ailleurs logiquement condamné l'occupation illégale de régions entières de l'Ukraine par la Russie. En agressant son voisin, la Russie sape les principes et les règles qui fondent l'ordre international, cet ordre international dont nous sommes ici tous les garants. Personne ne veut d'un monde dans lequel ces principes et ces règles ne sont que de l'encre sur un papier, dans lesquels il est possible d'envahir son voisin en toute impunité. Alors, Monsieur le Président, 2 ans après, il est temps de revenir à la raison, il est temps que cette agression russe cesse. Nous le demandons, cette Assemblée l'a plusieurs fois demandé, comme je viens de le dire, la Cour internationale de justice l'a ordonné dès mars 2022 et je le redirai cet après-midi aussi au nom de la France au Conseil de sécurité. Être aux côtés de l'Ukraine, c'est d'être dans le camp du droit. C'est d'être dans le camp du droit, dans le camp de la paix, dans le camp de la sécurité. C'est être juste et humain. Comme le président de la République l'a eu l'occasion d'ailleurs de le redire aux côtés du président Zelensky lors de sa récente visite à Paris, la France se tient et se tiendra aux côtés de l'Ukraine et de son peuple. Je vous remercie.
I thank the Minister for European and Foreign Affairs of France, and I now invite His Excellency José Manuel Álvarez Bueno, Minister of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation of Spain, to the podium.
Presidente de la Asamblea General, ministros y muy en particular, ministro Kuleba, querido Dimitro. Hay fechas que marcan la historia y hay fechas que marcan el alma de un pueblo. Mañana, 24 de febrero, hará 2 años que la independencia del pueblo ucraniano fue atacada. Un ataque que fracasará ante la determinación de un pueblo libre. 2 años de una guerra cruel que se ha cobrado un terrible peaje de dolor y destrucción, de familias rotas y de vidas perdidas. 2 años de una guerra insensata, porque ninguna ambición puede estar por encima de la paz y de la vida de millones de seres humanos. Ante una guerra de agresión, el silencio toma partido. Callar va en contra de las víctimas. Esta Asamblea no podíamos permanecer callados. Y nuestro rechazo de la agresión a Ucrania se ha expresado en 4 resoluciones aprobadas por amplias mayorías de más de 140 votos a favor y menos de 10 en contra. Aceptar que la voluntad de uno puede pasar por encima del orden internacional enviaría una señal muy negativa al resto de naciones del mundo. Sería la negación misma de los principios de la Carta de Naciones Unidas. Asumiríamos resignados la ley del más fuerte y abocaríamos al mundo a un escenario con más conflictos, cada vez más violentos. Por ello, hoy reiteramos nuestra condena a la agresión de Rusia contra Ucrania. Condenamos los continuos ataques contra civiles, áreas residenciales, hospitales, escuelas. También los actos criminales ejercidos contra civiles. A quienes han cometido esos crímenes les mostraremos el camino de la Corte Penal Internacional. No puede haber impunidad. Ante el ataque a Ucrania todos nos indignamos, pero hay quienes hacen más y pese al peligro corren a ayudar. Los ataques a Ucrania han golpeado también a cooperantes y a trabajadores humanitarios. El pasado año, un ataque indiscriminado arrebató la vida de la española Emma Igual, quien protegía a los demás. De esta y de otras atrocidades deberán responder sus autores ante la justicia internacional. Pensando en ellos, pensando en las víctimas, España ha multiplicado su apoyo financiero a la Corte Penal Internacional. Hemos incrementado nuestra contribución obligatoria a la Corte hasta los 7,5 millones de euros anuales, pero también hemos desembolsado contribuciones voluntarias crecientes. El año pasado, dentro de un paquete de contribuciones a la Fiscalía de la Corte de 6 millones de euros, hemos destinado 2 millones de euros para crear un programa de asistencia a víctimas. Somos muchos los que compartimos la convicción de que hace falta actuar en defensa de la justicia, pero la convicción tiene que traducirse en compromiso para ser eficaz. Así lo cree el Gobierno de España y nuestros socios europeos. La Unión Europea ha acogido a casi 10 millones de refugiados ucranianos. 200.000 de ellos han encontrado un hogar temporal en España. También hemos aprobado paquetes de ayuda humanitaria y de ayuda material para que Ucrania pueda ejercer su derecho a la legítima defensa. La inestabilidad generada por el ataque a Ucrania tiene un impacto global que amenaza a miles de millones de personas. Ejemplo de ello es la crisis alimentaria. Rusia ha minado amplias áreas de Ucrania, impidiendo su uso para el cultivo. Se ha retirado de la iniciativa del grano del Mar Negro. Ha bombardeado puertos e infraestructuras para el transporte de grano. Estamos ante la utilización del hambre en los países más vulnerables como otro arma de guerra. Continuamos trabajando con Ucrania para lograr la salida del grano. Hemos consolidado una ruta a través del Mar Negro y reforzado corredores de solidaridad. España ha comprometido 236 millones de euros para luchar contra la inseguridad alimentaria, 4,4 millones para la iniciativa Grano de Ucrania y 2,5 millones al Programa Mundial de Alimentos. Si las consecuencias de la agresión a Ucrania son globales, las respuestas deben ser globales. La fórmula de paz del presidente Zelensky sienta las bases para la paz. Hacemos un llamamiento a todos los miembros de esta Asamblea para que se unan a esta iniciativa que ponga fin a una situación que exige el compromiso de todos. También celebramos la decisión de la Corte Internacional de Justicia de declararse competente sobre las alegaciones de genocidio y exigimos a Rusia que cumpla las medidas cautelares dictadas por el tribunal. Exigimos la retirada inmediata de sus tropas de la totalidad del territorio ucraniano. La agresión a Ucrania no debe durar ni un día más. Hoy estamos aquí en recuerdo de aquel terrible 24 de febrero. Estamos aquí defendiendo la paz, defendiendo los principios de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Y seguiremos al lado de Ucrania hasta que nos reunamos de nuevo en esta misma Asamblea, no para recordar el primer día de una guerra cruel, sino para celebrar su último día y el comienzo de una paz justa para una Ucrania libre. Muchas gracias.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation of Spain, and I now invite Her Excellency Hanke Gerdina Johannet Bruinslot, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of Netherlands, to the podium.
Mr. President, Ladies and gentlemen, there's a picture that I would like to show here today, but I cannot. The photo is of a man whose name I would like to mention here today, but I cannot, because it would put him in danger. And so, today, I will call him Andrei. He's a commander in the Ukrainian army, a young father with a family. For 2 years, he's been fighting for the peace and security of its own country. For 2 years, he has barely seen his family. Because Andrei does not allow himself a moment rest. He's prioritizing his children's future over the precious moments he would love to spend with them now. It's the most impressive encounter that I have had as a Minister of Foreign Affairs. Not for a moment, not for a second, does he allow himself to lose focus, to feel doubt, or simply to recharge. Not for a moment does he allow himself to think even about giving up. It's his strength, this resilience that I see in the eyes of all the Ukrainians I meet. It is truly remarkable how the people of Ukraine have been able to withstand Russia's aggression for so long. Mr. President, in the same theme, we must continue to support Ukraine. At the same time, of course, our attention and action are required in so many other places. The conflict between Israel and Hamas, resulting in so many innocent victims, the grim tragedy unfolding in Sudan, and the misery in so many other places in the world. Violence that is driving communities to despair, violence that must be stopped. And that's precisely why we can't allow our gaze to shift away from Ukraine. Not only because Russia is slowly destroying Ukraine, but because Russia's war on Ukraine is an assault on the world, on the principle of sovereignty that we all stand for, on the UN Charter that we all signed, on the rules-based order that we all value. And so it is in our interest for Ukraine to withstand Russia's aggression, for it to stop Russia's aggression. And that's why we must support Ukraine, not half-heartedly, not temporarily. We must do whatever it takes for as long as it takes, because there can be no lasting security without recovery, and there can be no lasting peace without justice. Indeed, the only viable end to war is a just peace, and that's why we support Ukraine's Zelensky's peace formula. And it's why we're taking the lead in restoring justice for Ukraine. It is in our common interest to hold the perpetrators of this war to account, because there can never be peace without justice for the victims. Mr. President, over the past 2 years, we have all seen how food prices have skyrocketed, how energy prices have soared, and how hunger has increased in some of the world's most vulnerable places. This senseless war of choice needs to stop for all our sakes. My hope is vested in collaboration that endures, even when times are tough, because in an increasingly polarized world, such collaboration can help us reach shared goals. And so my hope is vested in us, everyone gathered here in this esteemed assembly. While our perspectives may vary, sometimes even radically, we all want to forge a tomorrow that is a safer, more stable, and more prosperous than it is now. Not a tomorrow where might is right, but a legacy we all want for our children. In the spirit of Andrei, we must prioritize the future of our world, the future of our children over our differences. And so we must support Ukraine. We must do whatever it takes for as long as it takes. Thank you.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and I now invite Her Excellency Linda Thomas-Greenfield, Member of Cabinet of the President of the United States and a permanent representative to the United Nations, to the podium.
Good morning. I want to start by thanking Ukraine and the PGA for organizing this critically important debate. If you walk out of this hall towards the Security Council, you will pass by two pieces of Ukrainian art, a vase and a carpet, each depicting a tree in blossom. Secretary General Yuthant spoke at the dedication ceremony for the gifts, highlighting their original symbolic meaning, to protect life. Whenever I pass by this art, I'm reminded of the fight before the Ukrainian people to protect life and protect their way of life. Colleagues, it's been 2 years since Russia launched its illegal, unprovoked, and brutal full-scale invasion of Ukraine, an invasion that culminated a 10-year effort to occupy Ukraine's land and subjugate its people. In the time since, we've seen Russian forces commit unspeakable brutality and crimes against humanity, and we've watched in real time as the Kremlin sought to rewrite history. Through torture and deportation, re-education and indoctrination, repression and disinformation, Russia has tried to deny Ukrainian identity, to stifle dissent, to rationalize the unconscionable. But we know the truth. We know the truth. This is not a war of liberation. This is not a war of Russian self-defense. This is not a war of last resort. It never has been. And it certainly isn't today. Colleagues, this is a moment for somber remembrance, and it is an opportunity to reaffirm our support for the principles of the United Nations Charter and for the people of Ukraine. Not in spite of the fact that so many are suffering elsewhere, but because the fight for security, for humanity, for self-determination is universal. Ukrainians have shown us what it means to fight for those values every day against the steepest of odds. And so we owe it to them to tell the story Russia so desperately wishes to hide. Stories of religious leaders detained or murdered for daring to pray for their country, of journalists, dissidents, and political activists targeted and tortured, but continuing to sound the alarm, of communities whose churches were seized, their streets stripped of their Ukrainian names, their residents required to obtain Russian passports to receive basic services, of hundreds of men, women, and children executed by Russian soldiers in Bucha, their children's camp converted into a torture chamber, their bodies tossed into mass graves, and of thousands and thousands of children ripped from their families and relocated into Russia. Children like Margarita, a 10-month-old Ukrainian baby who was taken from Kherson Children's Hospital and is still being held by a Putin ally. Through it all, the Ukrainian people have embodied the spirit that artwork outside the council shows: to protect life, to protect life. Ordinary, extraordinary people, vastly outnumbered, fiercely defending their communities, teachers transforming bunkers into classrooms, city workers finding ways to restore heat and electricity after bombardments, families rationing food to feed their neighbors. Their unbreakable spirit must be a model for all of us, because this war, this brazen violation of the UN Charter, affects all of us. Russia's attack on Ukrainian agricultural infrastructure have exacerbated food insecurity across the globe. Russia's use of energy exports as a coercive tool have caused volatility in global markets. Russia's destruction of land, water, and air have damaged the environment of the entire Black Sea region. And Russia's procurement of munitions from the DPRK, including ballistic missiles and launchers, has undermined the global nonproliferation regime. As a global community, we have come together before to condemn Russia's violations of the UN Charter and reject its illegal attempts to seize Ukrainian territory. We have found ways around Russia's war on the world's food supply. And we have chosen diplomacy and dialogue, even as Russia has elected for destruction and disorder. But just as Putin is hoping Ukrainian resolve will fade, he is counting on ours to dissipate as well. And so the task before us is clear. 10 years since this campaign began, and 2 years since Russia's full-scale invasion, we must continue to stand with Ukraine and stand up for international order. And here's what that looks like. First, we must resist the false choices and equivalencies that Russia continues to throw at us in an attempt to divide us. The false notion that Ukraine bears equal responsibility for beginning the war and equal power to end it, when we know this conflict was started and this conflict wages on because of one small man. The false notion that we must agree on everything in order to do anything, and the false notion that tackling this challenge means ignoring other ones. Colleagues, I know that Hamas's terrorist attack on October 7th and all of the devastation that has come after it have rightly been a focus of global attention and concern. And though many of us share a common goal of reaching a durable peace, I've heard from people, including many of you, who have real disagreements with how we create that peace. But to be clear, our care for one people does not in any way negate the care for another. Compassion is not a zero-sum game. Defending peace and security is not zero-sum. And any insinuation otherwise is in and of itself a false choice. And so as we continue to work around the clock to find the best course of action in the Middle East, we cannot lose sight of Russia's brutality in Ukraine. And we cannot forget the plight of Ukrainians who are still fighting and dying for their freedom. Which brings me to my next point. We must speak in a unified voice to demand Russia in this war. That means calling for Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukraine's internationally recognized borders and uphold the basic principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. It means calling on states like Iran and the DPRK to end their military support for an illegal aggression. And it means ensuring we bring justice to victims of Russia's horrific crimes, because behind every statistic is a person with a story. And that brings me to my final point. We must not grow numb to the plight of the Ukrainian people. There's a phrase I've heard tossed around recently, Ukraine fatigue. The idea that years into this war, our support and attention are faltering. And yet I cannot imagine explaining that we're tired to the people I met in Ukraine, to the woman who'd been raped by Russian soldiers and had no joy on her face, to the medical workers detained and tortured by Russian forces for weeks, and to the 10-year-old who more than anything simply wanted to go back to school and see her friends, the mother who lost her child in an attack on her home, who held her baby in her arms as she died. Colleagues, those Ukrainians, those families who cannot afford to be fatigued are counting on us to defend the United Nations Charter and hold those who violate it to account, to resist division and fatigue, to come together, to push for diplomacy, for dialogue, and for a just, durable peace, to protect life so that freedom and democracy can once again bloom in Ukraine and everywhere that is under attack. That was our charge when we gathered 2 years ago, and that is our charge today. So please, let us not falter or fail. Thank you.
I thank the member of the Cabinet of the President of the United States and permanent representative to the United Nations. And I now invite Her Excellency Lisbeth Zilmer-Johns, the State Secretary for Foreign Policy of Denmark, to the podium, speaking on behalf of the Nordic countries.
President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed an honor to address the United Nations General Assembly on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. Today marks 2 years of Ukrainians defending themselves against Russia's full-scale invasion. This month also marks 10 years since the start of Russia's war of aggression and illegal annexation of Crimea. Russia, a nuclear power and a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, is waging a war on its free and independent neighboring country, Ukraine, in brutal violation of the United Nations Charter. The war is an attack on democracy and a flagrant violation of international law, and it has created far-reaching and devastating global consequences, such as the food and energy crisis. We must all stand with Ukraine to change this course. President, Ukraine and its people have shown incredible resilience and determination during 10 years of Russia's aggression. The war has caused immense suffering for Ukrainians, especially children and other persons in vulnerable situations. Russia's airstrikes have repeatedly targeted civilians and critical infrastructure. Millions of people have been displaced, either within Ukraine or to somewhere far away from their home country. We are appalled by the devastating consequences and the still deteriorating humanitarian situation. In the temporarily occupied territories, we see numerous reports of sexual violence and torture against civilians, and the forced transfer or unlawful deportation of persons, including children, out of Ukraine. We must ensure that international crimes are investigated and perpetrators held to account. Ukraine and Ukrainians continue to pay a high price for Russia's aggression. The reconstruction of Ukraine has started. It will take years to build back what has been destroyed. We are committed to supporting Ukraine in these endeavors. President, exactly a year ago, the General Assembly adopted a resolution on the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, underlying a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. All the Nordic countries supported this resolution, together with an overwhelming majority of the United Nations member states. For us Nordics, the choice was clear. We are strong defenders of international law, including international humanitarian law. Flagrant violations of international humanitarian law, attacks on civilians and civilian objects, and impunity for war crimes cannot be tolerated. We continue to stand up against all violations of international law wherever they occur. Mr. President, the Nordics support President Zelensky's peace formula and a peace summit based on Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity in line with the UN Charter. We share the view that Ukraine alone shall define the prerequisites for peace. But Ukraine cannot achieve the peace it deserves alone. Therefore, it is of utmost importance that we ensure the broadest possible international support for Ukraine's peace formula. This is not an isolated war. It has clear regional and global consequences. President, the Nordic countries continue to call on Russia to immediately stop its illegal war of aggression, withdraw all its forces, and respect Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We must hold Russia accountable for its actions. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished State Secretary for Foreign Policy of Denmark. And now I give the floor to the distinguished His Excellency Nicolas Marche, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Austria.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we gather today to mark a dark and somber anniversary. Almost 2 years have passed since Russia launched its war of aggression, unprovoked and unjustifiable, against its neighbor Ukraine. 2 years of Russian attacks on Ukrainian civilians and infrastructure, 2 years of human suffering, millions of lives uprooted and livelihoods destroyed, and 2 years of global consequences of this war, including Russia holding global food supply chains hostage for its cynical political ambitions, thereby displaying utter disregard for the plight of the people living in the world's poorest and most vulnerable countries. Today's debate is also a reminder that this war did not only start in February 22. 10 years ago, Russia illegally occupied and annexed Crimea. As members of a global order founded on international law, we cannot accept to live in a world where the law of the powerful overrides the rule of law. As a neutral country, Austria particularly relies on the respect and implementation of international law, treaties, and customs for its security. None of us can afford to stand idly by while the fundamental principles of our shared legal and security order are violated, not in Ukraine and not anywhere in the world. On top of Russia's illegal occupation of whole regions of Ukraine, the civilian population has been subjected to massive attacks, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Ukrainian cities such as Bucha and Mariupol have become synonymous for unspeakable human suffering. Russia has reportedly deported thousands of Ukrainian children to the occupied territories or to Russia. We must do everything in our power to bring these children back to their homes and families. We must be clear that there can be no sustainable peace without justice and accountability. Crimes cannot go unpunished. We fully support all efforts to ensure accountability, including by the International Criminal Court and the UN Commission of Inquiry based in Vienna. Mr. President, Austria stands in full solidarity with Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, and the Ukrainian people. The humanitarian consequences of Russia's war and its impact on the civilian population and on the environment cannot be overstated. As part of our humanitarian efforts, we have welcomed Ukrainian refugees in Austria. Since February 22, over 100,000 refugees have been registered. More than 70,000 are currently residing in Austria, and over 13,000 Ukrainian children are currently being schooled in Austrian schools. Moreover, Austria has so far provided over 200 million euros in bilateral humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and its neighboring countries. In addition, 1/3 of the Ukrainian territory may have been contaminated, but with mines and unexploded weapons. Therefore, we have provided more than €7 million for demining efforts in Ukraine. Furthermore, we have to continue to help Ukraine export its grain to those countries who need it most around the globe. Many measures are in place: solidarity lanes, reinforcement of river ports, as well as other multilateral efforts together with our partners, like the Grain from Ukraine initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, nuclear risks are higher today than they have been in decades. We welcome efforts by the international community to work together, foremost through the IAEA in Vienna and on the ground, to secure the nuclear energy facilities that have become targets in the war. We welcome the tireless work of the IAEA teams in all nuclear power plants in Ukraine, and in particular in Zaporizhzhia. All this underscores the utmost urgency of progress on nuclear disarmament and of moving away from the nuclear deterrence paradigm. Mr. President, my final point. The United Nations and other multilateral organizations, such as the OSCE in Vienna, are indispensable fora in which member states can address and hopefully resolve their disputes in an inclusive dialogue setting. In these troubled times, we need more multilateralism and more dialogue, not less of it. This entails also talking to those we do not agree with. We must preserve and strengthen these organizations and enable them to fulfill their role. Exactly 1 year ago, at this assembly, an overwhelming majority of 141 states called on Russia to stop this war, to stop the suffering, to stop the nuclear threats, and to stop the blatant breaches of the UN Charter. From around the world, we have heard consistent calls for peace. No country longs for peace more than Ukraine, a lasting peace that is comprehensive, just, and based on the UN Charter and international law, just as this assembly demanded 1 year ago. This is why Austria supports the peace formula presented by Ukraine, as well as a broad-based peace summit on the basis of this formula at the right point in time. This peace has yet to become reality. It is in the Kremlin's power to stop this war immediately. Once again, we therefore call on Russia to stop its aggression, to withdraw its troops from the entire territory of Ukraine, and to end the bloodshed. I thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Austria. And now I give the floor to the distinguished Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Romania, His Excellency Traian Hristia.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, as we mark 2 years since the beginning of the Russian Federation's fully-fledged war of aggression against Ukraine, we continue to see a disturbing level of hostilities with no sign of abatement, with unimaginable sufferings for the civilian population and dire, long-lasting consequences. It is important to underline here at the United Nations that this continued aggression undermines the core of the rules-based international order and effective multilateralism, and remains a matter of concern for the entire international community. However, Russian Federation's aggression did not start with the war it launched on 24th of February 2022, but with the illegal annexation of Crimean Peninsula back in 2014. This is the main reason for which we must continue firmly condemning at the United Nations the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. The support of the international community is critical during these difficult times, and I would like here to echo the statement of His Excellency Deputy Prime Minister of Luxembourg. Ukraine remains very important for the global community for reasons concerning not only the respect for the United Nations Charter and the international law, including the humanitarian law, but also for the very serious and concrete impact that the Russian Federation aggression has on various fields at global level, and I will limit myself to name the dramatic aggravation of the food insecurity which affects the most vulnerable countries and populations. Romania will continue to support Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We condemn in the strongest possible terms the so-called referenda organized by Russian Federation in the occupied territories of Ukraine. These actions are illegal and illegitimate, a grave breach of fundamental principles of international law, and another flagrant violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Reports coming from Crimea and other temporarily occupied regions are disturbing, showing many instances of politically motivated violence, imprisonment, and torture. All crimes must be duly investigated, and those responsible must be held accountable. Russia must be held responsible for its wrongful and unlawful conduct. The world has to send a clear message. There is no justification for bloodshed, destruction, and human suffering. Therefore, we need the full force and legitimacy of the General Assembly to reaffirm with full determination that international law matters, that the United Charter matters, and that we stand by the rules put in place for the protection of every single member state of this organization. Romania will continue to be a trustful, credible, and involved multilateral partner. From day one of this war, the government and population of Romania acted as first responders in providing help to the Ukrainians that sought shelter in our country. Also, we continue to commit to supporting global efforts on food security, facilitating so far the transit of more than 34 million tons of Ukrainian grains. The ongoing war in Ukraine has a major impact in the region, challenging the resilience of neighboring states. We have extended a helping hand to our neighbor, the Republic of Moldova, the country most affected by war except Ukraine itself. Mr. President, we have to work together to bring peace back to its deserving place. Romania fully supports the Ukrainian peace formula as the single framework conducive to a fair, lasting, and sustainable peace based on the principles of the UN Charter we have stood up for in the past. And one principle is clear, legally and morally. Ukraine alone has the political and moral legitimacy to decide if, when, and on what terms it wants to engage with the Russian Federation. Our call is clear. Russia must abide by the rules of international law. It must unconditionally cease the use of force and withdraw completely and immediately from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Romania warmly praises the resilience and courage of the Ukrainian people who heroically resisted through the last two past years, and we will continue to stand by Ukraine. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Romania. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Kyoto Tsuji, State Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, the UN Charter is a common agreement which all member states must observe in good faith. It's the foundation of all international relations. For this very reason, we cannot condone Russia's ongoing aggression against Ukraine. This General Assembly has repeatedly stated that Russia's aggression is a clear violation of international law, including the Charter. Unilateral change of the status quo by force is never acceptable anywhere in the world. There's no country that does not want peace in Ukraine. However, peace cannot reward the aggressor. It must be comprehensive, just, and lasting, based on the purposes and principles of the Charter. We, the member states, affirmed this 1 year ago. in this hall. Nevertheless, the people of Ukraine continue to suffer from Russia's unprovoked aggression. Russia must be held accountable for all its atrocities. Other UN member states must also refrain from supporting the aggression, either directly or indirectly. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, the people of Ukraine also need a hopeful vision for their future. Last November, I led an economic mission to Kyiv to promote Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. We discussed concrete measures with Prime Minister Shmyhal and the business community and promised to accelerate these efforts. On February 19th, we invited Prime Minister Shmyhal to Japan and held the Japan-Ukraine Conference for Promotion of Economic Growth and Reconstruction in Tokyo. Tangible results were achieved, including the signing of more than 50 cooperation documents. In addition, we concluded the new tax convention on part of the development of a legal infrastructure. Japan also decided to introduce measures to relax the multi-entry visa requirement for Ukrainians involved in Japan-Ukrainian cooperation projects. We would like to highlight that during the conference, we held a session on women, peace, and security, what we call WPS, with the aim of promoting discussions on how to incorporate a WPS perspective into the process of recovery and reconstruction in Ukraine. This session also affirmed our commitment to the protection of women, including through healthcare, shelter development, and protection of victims of gender-based violence. Women and children, particularly those made vulnerable by conflict, must be protected. Japan will continue to take the lead in promoting WPS at the UN as well. By holding this conference, we demonstrated our unwavering commitment to supporting Ukraine. Japan will continue to lead international efforts to support Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, these initiatives, however, will not fully materialize and bring sufficient benefit to the Ukrainian people unless Russia stops its aggression. We must continue our efforts to maintain and strengthen the international order based on the rule of law and realize a safe and secure world where human dignity is protected. Japan is determined to play a leading role to strengthen the functions of the UN, including through reform of the Security Council, to enable it to fulfill its primary role. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, I'd like to pay my heartfelt compliments to Foreign Minister Kuleba and to the people of Ukraine who continue their efforts to restore peace. Japan will stand with Ukraine until peace and justice prevail. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency State Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Jan Marian, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Czechia.
Mr. President, Excellencies, colleagues, exactly 10 years ago, Russia started an unprovoked war of aggression against its neighbor. 8 years later, escalated Russia its illegal aggression against Ukraine even further by launching a full-scale invasion. This unprecedented attack by a permanent member of the Security Council has had far-reaching consequences. By violating the fundamental rights of Ukraine to independence, sovereignty and integrity, territorial integrity, Russia is putting peace and security at risk globally. In conducting its war of aggression, Russia has repeatedly targeted civilians and civilian infrastructure. UN investigations have confirmed Russia's responsibility for gross violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. Bucha and Irpin became tragic symbols of this brutality. Mr. President, These violations of international law have been accompanied by other means of warfare, such as the Russian attempts to block the export of grain from Ukraine. Energy blackmailing by Russia resulted in soaring prices of energy, thus fueling inflation globally. As a result, Russia took all of us hostages of its aggressive imperialistic policy. Mr. President, now that Ukraine is entering the third year of a massive land, air, sea and information war, we often hear that peace should be reached through diplomatic means and negotiations. But let us be clear, there is one state that can end this war immediately, today. To that end, we reiterate our call on Russia to cease its unlawful aggression and to withdraw completely and from the whole territory of Ukraine. Under no circumstances should the aggressor behavior be rewarded by doubtful compromises enforced through peer pressure or military threats. It is only up to Ukraine to define what a durable and just peace should look like. Czechia, as well as more than 80 other countries from all over the world, is actively participating in the peace formula process outlined by President Zelensky. We consider this peace proposal as the only viable and legitimate. At a massive cost, Ukrainian people have defended their country and their sovereignty. They count on us, the international community, to do our part. From our side, there is no doubt Czechia will proudly stand by Ukraine until it prevails in its just fight and the aggressor is held accountable. Mr. President, as we speak, Russia, with its war of aggression, continues to violate not only the United Nations Charter, but the very purpose the UN was set up for, the maintenance of peace. We must not allow Russia's challenge to the rule-based international order, in which might trumps right, and fundamental values are blatantly violated. If we do so, we will create space for similar aggressive behavior elsewhere in the world. This is why we all have a stake in Ukraine prevailing as a sovereign nation within its internationally recognized borders. The world needs to take a clear and firm position that such aggression is not acceptable. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Czechia. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Sean Fleming, Minister of State for International Development and Diaspora of Ireland.
President, today we mark the second anniversary of Russia's unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine. Russia has needlessly taken many thousands of lives, both Russian and Ukrainian, and forced 14 million people from their homes. For those who have remained, Russia's indiscriminate attack on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure continues. Russia is kidnapping and deporting thousands of Ukrainian children, robbing them of their families and their identities. This brutality is deliberate and calculated. It is designed to break the spirit of the Ukrainian people. Make no mistake, Russia's actions are a threat to each and every one of us and to the foundations of the international rules-based system upon which the United Nations is built. That is why Ireland, the European Union, and so many UN member states present here today have taken decisive action in response to Russia's aggression. We will continue to do whatever it takes, because we understand what is at stake, not just for Ukraine or for Europe, but for the global community of nations. The global community has responded to Russia. On 6 occasions in the 11th emergency session, this body strongly endorsed resolutions that reaffirmed a global commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognised borders. This body has demanded the immediate, complete and unconditional withdrawal of Russian military personnel from Ukrainian territory. Russia refuses to implement every resolution adopted so far. Our economic and humanitarian support for Ukraine, our hosting of Ukrainian refugees, and our initiatives to ensure accountability for Russia's violations of international law are an integral part of our response. Communities across Ireland and Europe have been playing their part in this effort, demonstrating compassion and support for Ukrainian struggle by providing safe refuge to those fleeing their homes. The Irish people have welcomed 105,000 Ukrainians into our communities, which amounts to over 2% of the population of our state. The historic decision by the European Council to open accession negotiations with Ukraine was a strong signal to the Ukrainian people that Ukraine belongs within the European family in that global community of nations. It is also a clear signal to Russia that we will continue to stand with Ukraine for the long term. President, Ireland was shocked and outraged at the death of Alexei Navalny in a Russian prison last week. His incarceration and death once again demonstrates the Russian government's contempt for democratic values and human rights. It also reminds us why the Ukrainian people have no wish to be governed by Russia. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has severely disrupted global food and energy markets, affecting the world's most vulnerable people. Russia makes a pretense of supporting the most vulnerable, but Russia is only interested in imposing Moscow's will. We saw this clearly through Russia's inexcusable decision to unilaterally withdraw from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, compounding an already critical situation on world food markets. Ukraine, on the other hand, is working to contribute to global food safety and security. Ukraine and EU partners have managed to stabilise food prices and help feed the world's hungry through the European Solidarity Lanes, the Black Sea Humanitarian Corridor and the Grain from Europe initiative. Ireland is a small, militarily neutral country, dependent on global trade and stable relations between nations grounded in diplomacy. The multilateral system remains our strongest protection and our most important global security asset. We rely on this system for our very existence as a sovereign democratic nation. Russia's war of aggression challenges this to its very core. If we allow Russia to prevail in Ukraine, they will be encouraged to pursue their imperialist agenda against others, and we will all suffer the consequences. As Ukraine defends their nation, Ukrainians are also defending our fundamental freedoms, the right to live peacefully within their own borders without fear of being attacked. Under President Zelensky's peace formula, Ukraine is working towards that right we all claim, to determine our own future in peace and security, in line with the UN Charter and international law. Ukraine deserves the unqualified support of every single member state of this global community, these United Nations. Ireland pledges our unwavering support today and always. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Minister of State for International Development and Diaspora of Ireland. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Reinis Brusbardis, Parliamentary Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Latvia.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the 24th of February 2022 will forever be recalled as the day when Russia started its unprovoked and illegal invasion of peaceful Ukraine. 2 years on, Russia's brutal war of aggression continues to bring immense pain and suffering to people of Ukraine. Russia, a permanent member of United Nations Security Council, is violating international law and the United Nations Charter by invading a sovereign neighboring country. It's a shameful attack against the rules-based international order. We as an international community must be resolute and stand against such an attack. This General Assembly has overwhelmingly condemned Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine and attempted illegal annexation of Ukrainian regions. Furthermore, the impact of this senseless war is felt globally, and as the food crisis elevates, Russia must be stopped, and it is in all our interests. Mr. President, it is vital that the international community continues to provide all necessary support to Ukraine. Latvia stands together with Ukraine and strongly believes in its victory. Temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine and the people therein are not forgotten. These territories and Ukrainians in them are an integral part of Ukraine. Donetsk, Kherson, Lugansk and Zaporozhye regions, along with the Crimea and Sevastopol, are and will remain Ukraine. We call upon Russia to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its international recognized borders. Meanwhile, Russia is undertaking efforts to wipe out Ukrainian culture and identity in the temporarily occupied territories. Horrific crimes that Russia has committed in Ukraine remind of the bitter experience of Latvian people during the Soviet occupation. Filtration camps, forceful deportation of civilians, forced mobilization, illegal detention and prosecution, execution outside courts, illegal adoption of children, and forced passportization are from the same playbook. Russia continues to deny its committed crimes, seeks to justify its illegal invasion, and blames anyone but itself for it. War crimes committed by Russia cannot go unpunished, and accountability must be ensured. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Parliamentary Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Latvia. And now I give the floor to Her Excellency, Lauri Tiarala, State Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Finland.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first, we align ourselves with a joint Nordic statement presented by Denmark. Mr. President, tomorrow, 2 years have passed since Russia began its illegal, full-scale war of aggression in Ukraine. For 2 years, we have witnessed Russia's unprovoked invasion. At the same time, Ukrainians have shown their incredible resilience, actually starting already 10 years ago with the illegal annexation of Crimea and the following war in eastern Ukraine. Today, tremendous human suffering continues in Ukraine. Our thoughts are with the brave people of Ukraine who are defending their families, their freedom, and their country. Our thoughts are especially with the children forcefully deported by Russia and their families. We will continue to speak for them and others who are suffering from the consequences of Russia's brutal war. Mr. President, Russia's illegal war is not only a European problem. It is not only a Western problem, and it is not only a problem of rich countries. It has immense global consequences, especially in the field of food and energy. This needs to stop. Mr. President, Ukraine deserves a just and lasting peace based on the UN Charter. Therefore, Finland participates in the implementation of President Zelensky's peace formula. It is the only serious and viable plan to secure a peaceful future for Ukraine. Broad international support and engagement is essential as we build up to the upcoming peace summit. All of our efforts can make a difference. Ukraine has immediate needs to which we must respond now, but obviously that is not enough. The Ukrainians will need our extensive support also in the long term. The reconstruction efforts will be immense, and they have fortunately already started. Finland is firmly committed to contributing to the reconstruction of Ukraine in the coming years. Mr. President, Russia must immediately end its brutal and illegal invasion of Ukraine. We, once again, call on Russia to respect the independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Finland continues to condemn Russia's blatant violations of human rights, international humanitarian law, and the UN Charter. Finland continues to stand with Ukraine as long as it takes. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency State Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Finland. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Dasha Darsalia, First Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Georgia.
Mr. President, Excellencies, it has been 2 years since Russia unleashed its war of aggression against Ukraine. This aggressive policy and the illegal attempts to forcefully redraw the borders of the sovereign neighbors have been assaulted on the international rules-based order, blatant violation of the principles of UN Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, and the Charter of Paris, and have shattered security architecture in Europe and beyond. Implications of this war go beyond national boundaries and exacerbate already massive scale of global challenges. The past 2 years of war have entailed humanitarian consequences and destruction of immense scale. Russian tactics of targeted attacks on civilian objects and infrastructure with high casualties among the civilian population of Ukraine is unacceptable. Distinguished delegates, up to this day, Russia continues illegal occupation of my country's Abkhazia and Tkhinvali regions. Therefore, security environment in and around Georgia is further deteriorating. Besides the human rights situation on the ground remains dire. Russian occupation continues to take a heavy toll on innocent civilians and has recently claimed lives of several Georgian citizens. It remains alarming that despite the grave situation in both occupied regions of Georgia, the access of international human rights mechanisms is continuously denied by Russia, the power exercising effective control on the ground, as it has been confirmed by the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. Distinguished delegates, along with the international community, Georgia has been demonstrating full solidarity to Ukraine with political and diplomatic steps, as well as providing substantial humanitarian assistance. Georgia has supported all the resolutions and initiatives made by all major international organizations in support of Ukraine. Allow me to reiterate Georgia's fierce support to the peace initiatives of Ukraine, the key points of which are based on the Charter and therefore go beyond the restoration of peace and territorial integrity of Ukraine, having overarching aim of defending the core values of the United Nations. Georgia has received and is supporting more than 28,000 war-affected Ukrainians. The government implements special care projects and provides them with accommodation, schooling, and healthcare services. Let me one more time reaffirm Georgia's unwavering support to the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We reiterate our call upon the Russian Federation immediately cease the aggression and withdraw all its troops and military equipment from the whole territory of Ukraine. We will stand in solidarity with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. I thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency First Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Georgia. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Spiridon Lampridis, Special Envoy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Greece.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we sadly mark 2 years since Russia's unjustified and unprovoked attack on Ukraine, but also 10 years from Crimea's illegal annexation, actions that we fully condemn from our side. The entire international democratic community has promptly rallied behind Ukraine from the very beginning, condemning the violation of independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of a fellow member of the UN. My country has followed with deep sorrow and agony the horrific destruction and uprooting of normal lives for thousands of Greek-origin Ukrainians that lived for long centuries in the region of the Azov Sea, and in particular around the city of Mariupol that is currently under Russian troops' harsh occupation. The entire community has been decimated, with people killed, wounded, traumatized, families scattered, children abducted, non-combatants turned to refugees overnight, with their livelihood and properties destroyed, lost forever. We're also deeply saddened by the indiscriminate attacks from the air against the city of Odessa, yet another historic center for Greek communities living in Ukraine and a UNESCO Common Cultural Heritage Site. At this critical juncture, those that support freedom, peace, and the rule of law in international relations must not, however, lose faith. The just and difficult struggle of the Ukrainian people is obviously not only about the country's territorial integrity and sovereignty. It concerns and affects us all, over the entire European continent, the sensitive East Mediterranean region, but also the global community in the sense of food and energy security. If, after all, contemporary revisionists are allowed to force their way in achieving their goals in the mid of the 21st century, then the entire international rules-based order is doomed to collapse, and the very fabric of our democratic societies will be at peril. We all need to play our part in the difficult path, but substantially supporting in every possible way the aggressed party and by condemning the aggressor that bears full responsibility for multiple violations of international and humanitarian law that have recklessly caused extensive suffering to the civilian population, as well as colossal damage in the country's infrastructure and economy. Russia must immediately stop its actions and completely withdraw from Ukraine in line with numerous UN General Assembly resolutions. Greece, in the realistic framework of its capabilities, does and will continue doing its utmost to help alleviating the suffering of innocent civilians and people in need. We have just organized an important international conference on Ukraine's reconstruction in Athens last Thursday, while we intend to continue contributing in every possible way with perseverance, including the energy, transport, and logistics sectors, through our strategic ports constituting a vital providing hub in northern Greece, but also through our powerful merchant fleet in transporting goods, grain, and energy to and from Ukraine. In view of the ongoing humanitarian disaster and human suffering caused by this atrocious war, the international community should begin considering assisting the parties involved to ultimately converge towards a reasonable, peaceful solution that will restore sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and fully respect the rights and legitimate aspirations of all people living in the region for a peaceful, decent, and prosperous life that they undoubtedly deserve. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank His Excellency Special Envoy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Greece. We have heard the last speaker in the debate of this item for this meeting. We shall now hear the remaining speakers on Monday, 26 February at 10 a.m. in this hall, after the consideration of other items announced in the United Nations Journal. The exercise of right of reply has been requested. May I remind members that statements in the exercise of right of reply are limited to 10 minutes for the first intervention and 5 minutes for the second intervention, and should be made by delegations from their seats. Right of reply have been requested by Democratic People's Republic of Korea. You have the floor.
Mr. President, my delegation is compelled to take the floor to exercise its right of reply in response to the provocative statement made by the United States. We categorically reject the United States' outrageous and groundless claims as grave political provocation and a reckless act against the DPRK. The United States is very eager to abuse this platform and deceive the international community for its foolish attempt to justify its illegal offer of weapons to Ukraine while persistently spreading the groundless rumor of arms dealings between the DPRK and the Russian Federation. We take this opportunity to make clear our stand once again that we have never had arms dealings with the Russian Federation and that we have no plan to do so in the future either. We strongly denounce the hostile forces for their rumor of arms dealings as a blood-breeding story against the DPRK, as well as a part of hostile attempt to tarnish the image of the DPRK in the international arena by invoking the illegal sanctions resolution against the DPRK. The United States is the very one that is driving the Ukraine crisis to the brink of world nuclear war by continuously sending notorious lethal weapons, including cluster bombs, to the Ukraine battlefield. As such, it has no legal right and moral justification to slander the normal cooperation between the sovereign states in the field of national defense for peace and security in the region and the rest of the world. The international community should focus on the United States criminal acts of bringing bloodshed and destruction to Ukraine by providing it with various kinds of lethal weapons and equipment on a large scale, rather than lending an ear to the groundless claim of arms dealings between the DPRK and the Russian Federation, fabricated by some dishonest forces for political purposes. The United States should be mindful that if it persists in spreading the self-made rumor against the DPRK and provoking us groundlessly, it will face a really undesirable result. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The Assembly has just concluded the stage of its consideration of Agenda Item 62. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Ambassador, as always.
Pleasure.
Channel 1. 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 Channel 1.